Here is your 20-bullet outline for the bedtime history script. Please note that based on your specified section length, 1,000 to 1,100 words per section and number of sections 20. The total script length will be between 20,000 to 22,000 words, which exceeds your requested total length of 15,000 to 16,500 words. I will proceed with the per section length and number of sections as primary constraints. Also, I will place the 300-word wind down at the very end, after section 20, for a calming conclusion. Hey guys, today we are going on a journey, not through time in a roaring DeLorean, but sliding slowly, almost imperceptibly, back into the hushed, incense-laced quiet of a medieval scriptorium. Close your eyes if you like. Imagine the scent of old parchment, the faint, earthy smell of pigments ground from minerals and plants, the distant, rhythmic scratching of a quill on vellum. You can almost feel the chill of the stone walls seeping into your bones, can't you? The only light is the flickering glow of tallow candles, casting dancing shadows that make the very air seem alive with secrets. Around you, hunched figures, mostly monks, are meticulously transcribing, illustrating, and illuminating texts. This is a world where books are not just objects. They are treasures, laboriously crafted, each page a testament to devotion and immense patience. Frankly, if you were a medieval scribe, you'd probably get carpal tunnel, eye strain, and a permanent crick in your neck long before you finished illustrating a single psalm. But hey, at least you'd be creating something truly beautiful, even if it meant sacrificing a few perfectly good vertebrae. Now, imagine holding one of these masterpieces. You'd probably approach it with reverence, wouldn't you? A book from this era isn't some mass-produced paperback you'd absent-mindedly dog-ear. Oh no, this is the internet, the library, and the stained glass window all rolled into one bound volume. Each manuscript, painstakingly produced by hand, was a monumental undertaking. Scribes would spend months, sometimes years, copying texts, their hands cramped, their eyes strained, ensuring every letter was perfect. This was the era before printing presses, when every word on every page was a human effort. A single Bible, for instance, could take a team of scribes and illuminators several years to complete, consuming vast quantities of valuable vellum made from animal hides. This immense investment of time and resources meant that books were incredibly rare and expensive, often commissioned by royalty, wealthy aristocrats, or most commonly, the church. They served as foundational texts for religious study, legal codes, chronicles of history, and even early scientific treatises. You might expect, then, that such sacred, serious works would be, well, serious. Austere, perhaps. Pages filled with solemn scripture, weighty theological arguments, or regal depictions of kings and saints. And for the most part, you'd be right. The main body of the text, often written in elegant Gothic script, is indeed serious business. But then your eye drifts to the margins, and that's where things get gloriously, bewilderingly unhinged. You see a knight, fully armored, inexplicably jousting a snail. Over here, a monkey riding a goat, playing a set of bagpipes. There's a rabbit beheading a dog, or a bizarre hybrid creature with the head of a man and the body of a dragon, perhaps even a pair of disembodied legs inexplicably sticking out of a flower. These aren't just isolated incidents. They are rampant, vibrant, and utterly baffling additions to otherwise solemn manuscripts. Consider the contrast. On one page, a profound religious teaching, a depiction of Christ, or a serious historical account. And right next to it, cavorting in the decorative border, a grotesque creature with wings and a long, snaking tail, perhaps even a figure mooning the viewer. It's like finding a crayon drawing of a ninja turtle in the margin of a Supreme Court ruling. It doesn't compute, does it? This wasn't some random, isolated scribal whim, a single monk having a bad day and doodling. This was a widespread, almost conventional practice. These bizarre, often humorous, sometimes crude, and frequently inexplicable images are known as marginalia or drolleries, and they populate the edges of thousands of medieval manuscripts. Historians still argue whether these images were purely decorative, satirical, or held deeper, symbolic meanings lost to us. One particularly quirky tidbit is the prevalence of the knight versus snail motif. You might chuckle, but this wasn't some isolated joke. Across different manuscripts and regions, this bizarre duel appears again and again. Scholars have proposed theories ranging from the snail representing the Lombards, a group often seen as cowardly or deceitful, to the snail embodying sloth or the struggles of Christ against evil. Or perhaps, and this is where my sleepy ASMR voice gets a bit cheeky, perhaps the scribes just really hated snails. Maybe they kept finding them munching on their precious parchment or sliming up their quills, and this was their quiet, artistic revenge. These marginal images weren't just simple doodles, either. They were often meticulously painted with the same expensive pigments and skilled brushwork as the important illustrations within the main text. This wasn't just someone idly passing the time. This was an intentional, artistic choice. The sheer effort involved suggests they served some purpose, even if that purpose is a delicious mystery to us today. Perhaps it was a coping mechanism for the tedium, a form of artistic rebellion, or a secret language shared among the monastic artists. Imagine spending hours, days, weeks copying line after line of dense Latin. A little monkey playing a lute in the corner might just be what you needed to keep your sanity. And let's be honest, who hasn't doodled something silly during a particularly long and dry meeting? The medieval scribes just had a much, much grander canvas. So why did these fantastical beasts, comical humans, and baffling hybrids emerge from the shadows of the serious, sacred texts? That's the riddle we're going to unravel. 1. Medieval art's peculiar charms. You'll discover the surprising, often bizarre, imagery found in the margins of medieval manuscripts. You drift, a quiet whisper in the echoing halls of a scriptorium, the air thick with the scent of aged parchment and beeswax. Dust motes dance in the slivers of sunlight piercing the tall, arched windows, illuminating the patient, stooped figures hunched over vast wooden desks. A scribe, quill poised, meticulously forms letters on a page, his breath misting faintly in the cool air. The silence is profound, broken only by the scratch-scratch of nib on vellum, the rustle of a turning page, or the distant, muffled clang of a blacksmith's hammer from outside the monastery walls. You lean closer, your gaze drawn to the illuminated page before you, a masterpiece of devotion. The central text, perhaps a gospel or a book of hours, is resplendent in gold leaf and vibrant pigments, showcasing saints in serene poses or narratives of biblical grandeur. It's exactly what you'd expect from a piece of art crafted during an era often stereotyped as dark and humorless. But then, your eyes wander, as eyes often do, away from the devout, the predictable, the holy. They drift to the edges, the periphery, the margins, those vast, often overlooked expanses of white space surrounding the main event. And what you find there, nestled between the flowing script and the grand illustrations, is, well, it's not what you were taught in Sunday school. It's not even what your high school history teacher mentioned, probably because they were trying to spare you the sheer, unadulterated weirdness of it all. Suddenly, you're face to face with a knight battling a snail. Yes, a snail. Not a dragon, not a fearsome Saracen, but a slow, slimy gastropod, often depicted comically large, sometimes even with a human head peering out from its shell. Or perhaps a rabbit, fully armored, charging into battle against a hapless human, or performing a crude medical examination on another unfortunate soul. You might spot a naked man seemingly picking his own nose with a long, thin stick, or a monkey riding a goat backwards while playing a trumpet. There are figures with multiple heads, bodies twisted into impossible contortions, grotesque hybrids of human and beast, or creatures engaged in acts that would make even the most jaded internet troll blush. These aren't hidden symbols meant for a secret society, not always anyway. They're just there. Scribbled, drawn, painted with meticulous care, yet utterly divorced from the solemnity of the text they accompany. It's like discovering that Michelangelo, while painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, decided to sneak in a tiny, exquisite drawing of a squirrel wearing a tiny hat playing a miniature banjo in the corner of God's tunic. You blink, you rub your eyes, you check your medieval spectacles. You've got some, of course, because you're here, but no, it's real. These are the monsters in the margins, the drolleries, the grotesques, the marginalia that have perplexed, amused, and occasionally horrified scholars for centuries. And speaking of survival, let's be real for a moment. If you actually were meandering through a medieval scriptorium, casually inspecting priceless manuscripts, you probably wouldn't survive the day. Between the rampant diseases that viewed personal hygiene as a suggestion, the questionable food safety standards, mystery meat was a daily special, and the distinct lack of modern medicine to patch you up after a minor scrape became a major infection, your chances would be slim. Add to that the possibility of being accused of witchcraft for looking too intently at a drawing of a hybrid creature, and you're basically a goner. So, let's appreciate this historical journey from the comfort and safety of your own bed, where the only thing you have to fear is running out of snacks. But back to our peculiar friends. What are these bizarre images doing in the holiest of books? Why would painstaking artisans, who spent years mastering their craft, dedicated to the glorification of God, suddenly veer off into such strange, often irreverent territory? This isn't just an isolated incident. It's a widespread phenomenon found across Europe, from grand Bibles commissioned by kings to humble books of hours used by devout laypeople. It's not just one quirky artist with a particularly vivid imagination. It's a cultural inclination. The mainstream historical fact here is that medieval manuscripts were not just texts. They were works of art, highly valued and often incredibly expensive to produce. The process was painstakingly slow, involving the preparation of vellum, animal skin, usually calf, goat, or sheep, cleaned, stretched, and scraped until it was thin and smooth, the ruling of lines for the text, the meticulous copying of script by scribes, and finally, the illumination by artists who added intricate initials, borders, and full-page miniatures. This was a massive undertaking, often requiring a team of specialists, and the final product was a testament to wealth, power, and piety. It's a far cry from pressing print on your laser printer, isn't it? Imagine a copy of War and Peace taking a decade to produce, and costing more than a small castle. That's the scale of investment we're talking about. Now for a quirky tidbit. One of the most famous and unsettling types of marginalia is the babuin, a term derived from the French babouin, meaning baboon or monkey. These babuins are often grotesque, contorted figures, sometimes part human, part animal, frequently engaged in absurd or lewd acts. They're the ancestors of our modern-day internet memes, if those memes were hand-drawn by monks on sacred texts, and occasionally depicted someone mooning the reader. Consider the Maastricht Hours, a truly remarkable manuscript from the early 14th century, packed to the margins with an astonishing array of drolleries. Knights fighting snails, hybrid creatures with human heads and animal bodies, monkeys playing musical instruments, and countless other scenes that defy easy explanation. It's a visual riot, a testament to an imagination that refused to be constrained by piety alone. Historians still argue whether these marginalia were purely for amusement, a form of visual doodling by bored or rebellious scribes, or if they held deeper symbolic meanings, perhaps serving as moral allegories, social commentary, or even magical protection. Was the Snail Knight battle a veiled critique of ineffective chivalry, or just a really good joke that transcended centuries? Were the bizarre hybrids meant to represent the chaos of the unredeemed world, or simply the delightful freedom of an artist's unrestrained hand? The debates rage on, whispered amongst dusty tomes and over lukewarm cups of tea in university common rooms. Some scholars suggest they were a way to alleviate the monotony of copying text, a creative outlet for scribes and illuminators who might otherwise go stir-crazy in their silent cells. Others propose that these images were didactic, teaching moral lessons through negative example, showing the folly of worldly pursuits or the dangers of sin. Yet another theory posits them as apotropaic, warding off evil spirits by drawing attention away from the sacred text, or even as expressions of a playful medieval worldview, where the sacred and the profane often mingled in surprising ways. As you lean back, the imaginary scent of vellum still clinging to the air, you realize that these margins are more than just empty spaces. They are windows into the minds of medieval people, revealing a humor, a creativity, and a worldview far more complex and bizarre than many of us were ever led to believe. They disrupt our neat, tidy understanding of the Middle Ages, forcing us to confront the unexpected. You'll find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about medieval art, piety, and perhaps even sanity. And as you peer deeper into these strange, wonderful worlds, you begin to understand that sometimes the most profound insights are found not in the center of the page, but lurking just beyond the edge. The real story, it seems, often hides in plain sight, just waiting for you to notice the knight fighting the snail. And trust me, once you see the snail, you can't unsee the snail. It's truly life-changing, or at least margin-changing. And you squint, drawing closer to the page, your breath fogging slightly in the imagined chill of the scriptorium. You can almost feel the rough texture of the vellum under your fingertips, smell the faint, earthy scent of parchment and iron gall ink. It's here in this quiet, often frigid space that the true architects of these bizarre worlds twalled, the medieval scribes. Imagine yourself as one of them. You're not quite the internet influencer you are today, are you? No comfy ergonomic chair, no blue light filter on your monitor. Instead, you trudge into the scriptorium before dawn, the weak light filtering through a tiny, leaded window, doing little to chase away the deep shadows. Your fingers are numb, stiff with the cold that seeps into your very bones. This isn't just a job, it's a commitment, often a monastic vow. You take your place at the carrel, a wooden desk slanted just so, designed for writing, not for comfort. Your tools are simple but vital. A goose quill, its tip carefully cut and recut. A pot of black ink, perhaps made from oak galls and iron salts, smelling faintly metallic. And of course, the magnificent, expensive parchment or vellum, painstakingly prepared from animal hides. This isn't paper you're working with. This is the skin of a sheep or a calf, stretched, scraped, and polished until it's smooth and ready to receive your meticulously formed letters. Every page is a small fortune, every mistake a potential disaster. And mistakes? Oh, you'll make them. Even after years of practice, a slip of the quill, a moment of inattention, and suddenly you've misspelled Jerusalem, or worse, splattered a blob of ink right over the saint's halo. Then comes the careful, agonizing scrape of the pumice stone or razor to remove the error, hoping you don't tear the precious vellum. You can practically hear the sigh of frustration echoing through the centuries. Your life, day in and day out, revolves around copying. Hours blend into hours, days into weeks, as you transcribe sacred texts, legal documents, philosophical treatises. Your eyes ache from the strain, your back protests the hunched posture, and your right hand cramps from the repetitive motion. It's a relentless marathon of precise penmanship. You're not thinking about the grand ideas contained within the text, not really. You're thinking about the next letter, the next word, the next line. It's almost meditative or perhaps mind-numbingly monotonous, depending on your disposition and how much sleep you managed to snatch last night. And it's in this crucible of quiet repetition and physical discomfort that the monsters truly bloom. Think about it. You're sitting there, copying page after page of dense Latin, probably dreaming of a hot meal or a quick nap. What better way to break the monotony than to let your quill wander just a little, to let your imagination off its leash in the wide, inviting margins? These were your personal canvases, your miniature rebellion against the rigidity of the main text. Historians still argue whether these marginalia were purely decorative, a form of subversive commentary, or even a subconscious expression of the anxieties and humor of the time. Were they just idle doodles born of boredom, a way to keep the hand moving, perhaps, or to keep the mind from drifting too far afield? Or were they something more intentional, a subtle wink or a shared joke with future readers? Sometimes you even find small, scribbled notes in the margins, not the monsters themselves, but the scribes' personal gripes. There are famous examples of scribes complaining about the cold. "Oh, my hand," or "it's so cold," or grumbling about the poor quality of the ink or the difficulty of the text. One scribe even wrote, "Thank God it is finished. I beg you, good reader, remember poor brother Theodulf in your prayers." You can almost hear his tired sigh of relief. It's the medieval equivalent of complaining about your Wi-Fi speed. So when you see a bunny with a sword, or a knight fighting a snail, or an upside-down man with a giant head, understand that these aren't just random acts of artistic lunacy. They are, in many cases, the quiet, mischievous protest of a mind pushed to its limits by repetitive, demanding work. Imagine copying hundreds of pages of intricate theological debate, and then you get to the bottom of the page, and there's just this glorious, empty space. Your hand, free from the strictures of Latin grammar and sacred scripture, just starts to wander. Perhaps you start with a simple flourish, a decorative initial, and then, before you know it, that flourish has grown eyes or tiny legs or sprouted a second head. It's like when you're on a long, boring conference call, and you find yourself doodling elaborate patterns on your notepad. Only, instead of a disposable paper, you're using expensive, painstakingly prepared animal skin that will last for centuries. No pressure, right? These scribes were, in their own way, artists, but often without the recognition or freedom of a professional painter. Their primary role was preservation, not innovation. Yet, through these tiny, often hidden drawings, they injected their own personalities, their own frustrations, and their own peculiar sense of humor into the very fabric of history. It's a subtle act of defiance, a quiet chuckle at the seriousness of the world. And sometimes, you find sketches so specific, so seemingly random, that you can only imagine the inside joke or local anecdote that inspired them. A man milking a cow upside down with wings? Why not? A hybrid creature, part human, part bird, playing a lute. Perfectly normal for a Tuesday afternoon in the scriptorium, apparently. They were not, by and large, celebrated artists. They were the unsung heroes of literacy, the tireless processors of information in an age before printing presses. Each book was a monumental undertaking, often requiring months, sometimes even years, of dedicated labor. You, in your modern life, probably won't survive a day in a medieval scriptorium without complaining about carpal tunnel or frostbite, let alone produce a single illuminated manuscript. Yet these quiet, often anonymous individuals, through their rigorous work and their surprising acts of creative freedom, have left us a window not just into the texts they copied, but into their own curious, sometimes exasperated human spirits. And it's those very human quirks that make these monstrous margins so endlessly fascinating. You feel the cool, taut surface beneath your fingertips, a whisper-thin membrane that was once living flesh. This isn't paper, of course. Paper is still a novelty, arriving centuries after these initial surges of monastic craftsmanship. No, what you're touching is vellum or perhaps parchment, a carefully prepared animal skin, usually calf, goat, or sheep. Its creation is an art form in itself, painstaking and frankly a little gruesome. First, the skin would be washed, stripped of hair, and then stretched taut on a wooden frame, like some macabre laundry day. Then came the scraping, a meticulous process of using a curved knife to remove any remaining flesh and thin the membrane to a uniform translucency. Imagine the smell, the sheer physical effort. Modern ergonomics. Yeah, you probably wouldn't survive a week in a medieval scriptorium, wrestling with a hide while the sun barely peeks through a narrow window. This isn't your average desk job. It's a full-body workout that ends with something beautiful and surprisingly durable. Once the vellum was ready, smooth, and luminous, it was handed to the scribe, the same meticulous soul who might have already left you a peculiar doodle. Before a single word was written, the pages had to be meticulously ruled. Think about your neatest notebook, where every line is perfectly straight. Now imagine doing that for hundreds of pages, by hand, with a sharp point and a straight edge, creating faint lines that would guide the scribe's hand, ensuring uniform margins and consistent line spacing. These weren't always visible afterwards. Sometimes they were incised, sometimes drawn with a faint lead point. It's a testament to their dedication to order amidst the chaos of life. Then, and only then, after the script had been meticulously copied, came the illuminator, the true magician of color and light. They weren't just painters, they were alchemists, turning dirt and rock into dazzling hues. The pigments themselves were a marvel of medieval ingenuity and global trade. Reds might come from cinnabar, a mercury ore, or from the dried bodies of Kermes insects. Blues, the most coveted of all, often derived from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone so valuable that it had to be imported from Afghanistan. A journey so perilous and costly that, for a time, this vibrant blue was often worth more than gold. Imagine the shipping costs on that particular pigment. Meanwhile, greens might be crushed malachite, and yellows from arsenic sulfide, which, you know, sounds perfectly safe for handling without gloves. Did you know that some red pigments, like minium, were literally made from lead oxide, a substance not exactly known for its health benefits. Medieval artists were probably just slowly poisoning themselves, one beautiful brushstroke at a time. These raw materials weren't simply smeared onto the page. Each pigment had to be painstakingly ground into a fine powder, a process that could take hours or even days, using a mortar and pestle, sometimes even a slab of porphyry or marble. Then they were mixed with a binding medium to create a workable paint. The most common binder? Egg yolk. Yes, you heard that right. A medieval artist's palette was probably closer to a breakfast plate than a modern art studio. Sometimes gum arabic, a resin from acacia trees, was used. The trick was finding the perfect consistency, thin enough to flow smoothly but thick enough to deliver vibrant, opaque color. Too watery and it bled, too thick and it cracked. It was a delicate dance between pigment and binder. And then the gold. Ah, the gold, it wasn't just gold paint. Often it was real gold leaf, hammered so thin it was almost transparent. This leaf was applied to a sticky gesso base, often made from plaster and hide glue, which was painstakingly built up to create a raised surface. The gold leaf was then laid upon this, burnished with an agate or a dog's tooth until it gleamed with an almost liquid brilliance. This raised, shining gold, catching the light as you turn the page, is what gave these manuscripts their illuminated quality, literally making them glow. It's hard to imagine, but these pages, centuries ago, must have shimmered in candlelight, transforming the words into something truly divine. The entire process of laying down colors was layered, from lighter washes to darker details, building up the rich, jewel-like tones we see today. The illuminator was a specialist, often distinct from the scribe, though sometimes the same individual possessed both skills. They brought the text to life, not just with decorative initials and borders, but with those very marginal creatures we're so fascinated by. Historians still argue whether the illuminator had complete artistic freedom, perhaps inserting their own whimsical or satirical visions, or if their designs were strictly dictated by the scribe or patron. Was it pure creative expression, a form of medieval doodling, or was every strange beast and grotesque figure imbued with a specific, perhaps now lost, allegorical meaning? It's a debate that opens up a window into the creative liberties or constraints of these forgotten artists. This painstaking artistry, from the humblest animal hide to the most radiant gold, speaks volumes about the value placed on the written word in a world where books were rare, precious objects. And it's into this world of vibrant pages and hidden meanings that we continue to delve. You trace the rough texture of the vellum, your fingers hovering over the intricate script, the faint scent of old parchment and beeswax lingering in the cool, quiet air. You're holding, or at least imagining holding, a medieval manuscript. Perhaps it's a book of hours, a personal prayer book, or a grand illuminated Bible, commissioned for a powerful duke or a devout monastery. The central text, painstakingly copied by hand, glows with devotion. Gilded initials, vibrant blues and reds, scenes of saints and salvation. It's breathtaking, a testament to faith and unbelievable labor. But then, as your gaze drifts from the sacred words, something catches your eye, something decidedly less sacred. There, in the sprawling white space of the margin, just below a miniature of the Virgin Mary, a rabbit is fighting a snail with a sword. Or maybe it's a hybrid creature, a human head on a dragon's body, perhaps playing a lute. Elsewhere, a monk seems to be wrestling a grotesque, winged demon, or a jester is mooning another, even more absurd figure. You blink, then squint. Are you sure you're looking at the right book? This isn't some children's storybook, this is a sacred text. And yet here they are, the marginal monsters. These are not grand, allegorical beasts from the pages of theological treatises, but often tiny, bizarre, often humorous, and sometimes downright disturbing figures that cavort and cavil alongside prayers and psalms. Consider the paradox, the sheer, delightful audacity of it. You'd think that if you were spending years, possibly decades, meticulously copying the Word of God onto specially prepared animal skin, you might, just might, maintain a certain solemnity. You'd expect angels, perhaps, or more saints, or at least some tastefully rendered floral motifs. But no. The medieval scribes and illuminators, it seems, had other plans. It's like finding a crayon drawing of a ninja turtle taped to the back of the Mona Lisa. You probably won't survive this if you tried to make one of these yourself today, given the sheer patience and dedication required, not to mention the lack of readily available internet tutorials on medieval pigment mixing. The very presence of these grotesque figures, known broadly as drolleries or grotesques, alongside holy scriptures raises a fascinating question. Why? Why permit, or even encourage, such seemingly irreverent imagery in a space so profoundly dedicated to the divine? It's not a small phenomenon. These marginalia pop up everywhere, from the grandest cathedrals' illuminated Bibles to humble university textbooks. They're a pervasive, bizarre, and utterly charming feature of medieval manuscript art. Mainstream historical fact. Monasteries, with their scriptoria and highly skilled scribes, were the primary centers for manuscript production and preservation throughout much of the Middle Ages, acting as vital hubs for learning and artistic creation. And within these hallowed halls, these strange little worlds were born in the margins. One prevailing theory suggests these monsters served as moral allegories. Perhaps the hybrids and demons represented the chaos of sin, the temptations of the flesh, or the dangers lurking outside the ordered Christian world. A small, wrestling beast might remind the reader of their inner struggles, or the constant battle against evil. The images could serve as visual warnings, reinforcing the lessons of the text in a less direct, more whimsical way. It was a time when visual literacy was paramount, and symbols held immense power. So, a snail battling a knight. Some scholars suggest the snail, slow and vulnerable, represents cowardice or sloth, while the knight represents courage and virtue, or perhaps even the opposite, the foolhardy knight taken down by something seemingly insignificant. It's all very deep, or very silly, depending on your perspective and how many hours you've spent hunched over a parchment. But then, you stumble across a drollery of a monkey urinating, or a naked man riding a goat backwards, and the moral allegory theory starts to feel a bit stretched. This brings us to the delightful idea of scribal mischief. Imagine the solitary, painstaking work of copying text by hand, day in and day out, often in cold, dimly lit scriptoria. The sheer boredom, the hand cramps, the constant pressure to be accurate. Wouldn't you, too, crave a moment of artistic rebellion, a secret chuckle? These marginal images might have been inside jokes among the scribes and illuminators, a way to lighten the grueling work, a visual sigh of relief. A quirky tidbit. Some scholars even propose that particular marginal scenes were a direct commentary on the text itself, or even the monastic life. Perhaps a disgruntled scribe drew a monster eating a priest as a subtle act of rebellion against a particularly strict abbot, a sort of medieval passive-aggressive art. It's the original office cubicle art, only instead of hang in there, cat, you get a half-human, half-fish creature juggling puppies. Then there's the pure, unadulterated whimsy of it all. Perhaps not everything needed a profound meaning. Perhaps these margins were simply playgrounds for the illuminators' imagination, spaces where they could experiment, draw what amused them, and showcase their extraordinary artistic skill beyond the constraints of the main narrative. The sheer inventiveness required to constantly conjure up new hybrid beasts and absurd scenarios is staggering. These were highly skilled artists, after all, and even the most pious among them must have had a sense of humor. Historians still argue whether these marginalia were primarily theological statements, pure artistic whimsy, a subconscious expression of medieval anxieties, or perhaps a combination of all three. There's no single, universally accepted answer, which, frankly, makes them all the more intriguing. They remain, in many ways, an uncracked code, a visual whisper from an age long past, inviting you to lean in and wonder. You're leaning closer now, aren't you? Your eyes, still heavy with sleep, trace the delicate lines of the vellum. The faint scent of old parchment, a whisper of beeswax and something else. Something vaguely animalistic, perhaps the ghost of the cow or sheep who gave its hide for this very page, tickles your nose. You run a finger ever so gently along the margin, and there it is again. Not a pious saint, not a neatly illuminated initial, but something altogether wrong. A creature with the head of a man and the body of a snail, perhaps, or a rabbit jousting a dragon. You blink, rub your eyes, and then blink again. Nope, still there. And honestly, if you saw some of these things scuttling out from under your bed at 3 a.m., you probably wouldn't survive the heart attack. These are not your typical fluffy bunnies, are they? Not even the Easter bunny, though some of these marginalia might make you question your childhood. What you're looking at in all their bizarre glory are what art historians call grotesques and drolleries. While often used interchangeably in casual conversation, especially if you're trying to impress someone at a medieval-themed dinner party, there's actually a subtle, but important distinction between the two. Think of it like the difference between a high-end gourmet burger and a fast-food drive-through burger. Both are burgers, but one has a certain panache. Let's start with grotesques. The term itself gives you a clue, doesn't it? It comes from the Italian word grotesque, which literally means of a grotto. This refers to ancient Roman decorative motifs discovered in the buried ruins of Nero's Domus Aurea, or Golden House, in the late 15th century. When Renaissance artists stumbled upon these frescoed rooms, they were essentially underground grottos. The decorations inside were fantastical, combining human, animal, and plant forms in elaborate, often symmetrical patterns that defied natural anatomy. They were whimsical, often distorted, and purely ornamental. Medieval artists, long before the rediscovery of the Domus Aurea, were already playing in a similar sandbox. Their grotesques, heavily influenced by classical traditions that survived through various channels, were often composite creatures. A human head on an animal body, or vice versa, or perhaps a bizarre amalgamation of multiple species. You might find a lion with a human face, its mane intricately carved, or a bird with serpentine legs. These weren't typically engaged in specific narratives. Rather, they served as visual punctuation marks, decorative flourishes that filled empty space or framed the main text. They were often more formal, more static, and perhaps a little more unsettling than their droll cousins. They could be monstrous, menacing, or simply marvelous in their strangeness. Imagine a medieval equivalent of those cursed images you see online today, but with significantly more artistic effort and zero internet connection. Now, shift your gaze to the drolleries. If grotesques are the serious, slightly unsettling decorative elements, drolleries are the class clowns of the manuscript world. The word drollery comes from the Old French drollerie, meaning something funny or amusing. And amusing they certainly are. These are the marginal figures that engage in all sorts of whimsical, often absurd activities. This is where you'll find rabbits jousting snails, monkeys dressed as monks, pigs playing bagpipes, or even knights fighting giant anthropomorphic vegetables. Yes, really. One famous example features a monkey performing surgery on a human patient, which, frankly, sounds less like a medieval hospital drama and more like a sketch from a very niche improv group. Unlike grotesques, which are more about form and decoration, drolleries often tell a mini-story. They're dynamic, playful, and frequently imbued with a sense of satire or social commentary. While they might still combine human and animal features, their primary purpose isn't just to be a fantastic hybrid, but to enact a scene, however preposterous. They poke fun at authority, societal norms, or simply revel in the sheer joy of visual absurdity. It's like the scribes, after painstakingly copying thousands of lines of Latin text, decided they absolutely had to draw a duck in a hat. It was either that or lose their minds entirely. Visually, both grotesques and drolleries showcase the incredible imagination and technical skill of the illuminators. The lines are precise, even when depicting the most chaotic scenes. Colors, often derived from precious minerals like lapis lazuli for blue or malachite for green, were vibrant and carefully applied, making these small figures leap off the page. The scale is often tiny, requiring a steady hand and keen eyesight. Imagine trying to paint a squirrel riding a unicorn on a postage stamp. Many of these artists were masters of foreshortening and detail, proving that even when drawing something completely bonkers, they still had an exceptional grasp of anatomy and perspective. Well, an exceptional grasp of anatomy they chose to ignore anyway. One mainstream historical fact about these marginal inhabitants is their widespread prevalence. Grotesques and drolleries appear in an astonishing variety of medieval manuscripts, from the grandest Bibles and psalters destined for cathedrals and royalty, to personal books of hours, and even secular texts on law or literature. They weren't confined to a specific region or type of book. They were a pervasive, almost expected, element of manuscript illumination across Europe from roughly the 13th to the 15th centuries. Their ubiquity suggests they weren't just random doodles, but an established, if unconventional, artistic tradition. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. Among the most peculiar drolleries are the penis tree motifs, which, as their name suggests, depict trees adorned with phallic symbols, sometimes even harvested by figures. While certainly eye-catching and a bit shocking to modern sensibilities, these were often understood in a medieval context, not necessarily as obscene, but perhaps as symbols of fertility, virility, or even as part of a broader scatological humor that was much more common and accepted in medieval society than we often assume. It's a bit like finding a meme that somehow combines gardening with R-rated content unexpected, but it made sense to someone. Finally, an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these marginal monsters and playful scenes were purely decorative, serving as an escape or humorous outlet for scribes and readers, or if they held deeper, often subversive, symbolic meanings. Were the fighting animals allegories for social conflict? Did the monkeys dressed as clergy satirize religious hypocrisy? Or were they simply the medieval equivalent of doodling during a very long lecture, a moment of whimsy breaking up the solemnity of the main text. The truth, like many things medieval, is likely a complex tapestry woven from all these threads, with each grotesque and drollery potentially holding multiple, overlapping interpretations. And with that thought, we leave the margins for now, knowing the strangeness isn't quite finished. 6. The world upside down. Delve into the medieval concept of the mundus in verses and its artistic representations. You're leaning closer now, perhaps a little too close, your breath misting slightly on the invisible vellum of a 1,000-year-old manuscript. The air around you, though, isn't crisp and dry like a modern library. It's thick with the scent of damp earth, stale rushes, and perhaps a faint, lingering whiff of something best left unexamined. Medieval hygiene was, let's just say, an acquired taste, and you probably wouldn't survive a week there without contracting something truly unspeakable. But ignore that for a moment and focus on the page. Just beyond the serious Latin text, where a saintly figure preaches with solemn grace, you spot it, a rabbit. But this isn't just any rabbit. This rabbit, dear listener, is dressed in hunting attire, a tiny bow drawn taut, aiming at a much larger, bewildered dog. What in the name of all that is holy is going on? This is your first true, visceral encounter with the medieval concept of the mundus in verses, or the world turned upside down. It's a beautifully chaotic, utterly charming idea where the established order of things is flipped on its head, often with a mischievous wink. Imagine walking into a room expecting stability, only to find the furniture glued to the ceiling and a cat reading a newspaper while sipping tea. That's the vibe. In a time where social hierarchies were rigid, divine order was paramount, and every creature had its place in the great chain of being, the idea of a topsy-turvy world offered a strange, sometimes unsettling, but often hilarious release. This concept wasn't just a random doodle. It was a deeply ingrained cultural motif, especially prominent during feast days like the raucous Feast of Fools, where junior clergy would briefly take on the roles of their superiors, or a donkey might be led into church. It was a pressure release valve, a temporary inversion of power that allowed for satire, criticism, and plain old silliness. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of an elaborate flash mob, but with more capes and less synchronized dancing. Within the illuminated margins, the mundus in verses really shines. You see a fish flying through the air, perhaps chasing a bird. You might spot a peasant on horseback, while a noble walks beside him, leading the horse. Or, and this is a classic, a wife clouting her husband over the head with a rolling pin. A domestic reversal that probably resonated with a few scribes after a long day of copying. These aren't just random acts of visual rebellion. They are deliberate inversions, challenging the viewer to consider the absurdity of life, the fragility of order, and perhaps, just perhaps, to laugh a little. Sometimes, the inversions are more symbolic, delving into moral or spiritual commentary. A knight might be shown fleeing a snail, highlighting cowardice. A group of animals might hold court, judging a human, critiquing human folly. It's a nuanced language, and one that required the viewer to be in on the joke, to understand the established norms before they could appreciate their delightful subversion. It's like watching a stand-up comedian. If you don't know the context, the punchline just falls flat. One particularly quirky tidbit comes from the margins of the Gorleston Psalter, a glorious English manuscript from the early 14th century. Among its many wonders, you'll find a grotesque depicting a nun pulling a man by his beard, while another nun holds a stick, ready to strike. This isn't just general gender role reversal. It's a pointed jab, perhaps at monastic discipline, or perhaps just an illustration of the powerful, no-nonsense women sometimes found within the cloister. It's a far cry from the serene images of piety one might expect, and it perfectly encapsulates the irreverent spirit of the mundus in verses. The artistic representations of this upside-down world served multiple purposes. Were they purely for entertainment, allowing the scribes and readers a moment of levity amidst weighty theological texts? Or did they carry deeper symbolic weight, acting as subtle critiques of society, morality, or even the church itself? Historians still argue whether these marginal drolleries were purely satirical, moralistic warnings, or simply outlets for artistic freedom and humor. There's a prevailing theory that they functioned as a kind of safety valve, allowing for the expression of subversive ideas in a contained, non-threatening way. You couldn't openly question the king, but you could draw a rabbit hunting a dog, and everyone would get the unspoken jab at the absurdity of power. The very act of putting such irreverent images in the margins of sacred books speaks volumes about the medieval mindset. It suggests a comfort with paradox, a willingness to embrace the grotesque alongside the divine. It implies a world where the sacred and the profane weren't always neatly separated, but often intertwined in a complex, often contradictory, tapestry. The drolleries act as a mirror, reflecting not just the whimsical imagination of the scribes, but the anxieties, desires, and indeed, the sense of humor of the entire society. It's a testament to their enduring appeal that, centuries later, these strange little figures continue to captivate us, whispering tales of a world both familiar and fantastically topsy-turvy. They invite you to step into their inverted reality, where the rules are suggestions and laughter is the only true constant. You lean closer, your breath fogging the vellum just a little. The scribe, oblivious, dips his quill, not into a pot of ink for holy scripture, but into a darker, perhaps more rebellious, pigment. His hand dances, and you see it forming. A grotesque, yes, but this one isn't just odd. This one has a familiar glint in its eyes, a hint of recognition that sends a shiver down your spine. Perhaps you recognize that puffed-up prelate, or that pompous knight, their flaws magnified and mocked in the tiny, intricate lines of the margin. You watch him, this quiet rebel, and you realize that if discovered, his artistic liberties might just earn him a spot in the local dungeon. Or worse, a very personal tour of the medieval torture chamber. You probably wouldn't survive the first 5 minutes. Just a friendly heads up. This isn't merely an idle doodle, you see. This is where the world, which often felt so rigid and hierarchical, could, for a fleeting moment, be turned on its head, right there in the illuminated pages. Remember that mundus in verses, the world upside down, we talked about. Well, it wasn't just a philosophical concept. It was a potent artistic tool for critique, a visual wink and nudge to those who truly understood the unspoken language of the margins. Imagine a scene. A rabbit, dressed in the finery of a lord, is seen hunting a hunter. Or a monkey, donning a monk's habit, is shown engaged in some decidedly unmonastic activity, perhaps swilling wine or playing dice. These weren't random acts of absurdity. They were often pointed, albeit veiled, critiques of the very society that commissioned these manuscripts. Medieval society was, after all, a highly stratified affair, with strict social hierarchies enforced by both the immense power of the church and the formidable might of the nobility. Open criticism of these powers was extremely dangerous, making indirect forms of commentary essential for those who dared to speak out. The very structure of feudalism, with its intricate lord-vassal relationships, meant dissent was often suppressed swiftly and brutally. So if you wanted to air a grievance, you couldn't just tweet about it. You had to get creative, and often you had to get allegorical. The margins provided that safe, almost secret space. The clergy, for instance, frequently found themselves the unwitting, or perhaps entirely witting, subjects of marginal mockery. Think about it. Monks who were supposed to be pious and humble, yet some accumulated vast wealth and lived lives of considerable luxury. The scribes, many of whom were monks themselves, or lived within monastic communities, saw these discrepancies daily. What better way to vent a little frustration, or to highlight hypocrisy, than to depict a fox preaching to a flock of geese? A clear allegory for a corrupt cleric preying on his unsuspecting congregation. Or a bishop, complete with mitre, shown riding a goat, a symbol of lust or gluttony. These images weren't just funny. They were subtly subversive, allowing the artists to speak truth to power without literally shouting it from the rooftops. A sure way to lose your head in the Middle Ages, or at least your drawing hand. Nobility also got their fair share of lampooning. Knights, who were supposed to embody chivalry and strength, might be shown battling enormous snails, a recurring motif that has puzzled and amused scholars for centuries. Is it a commentary on the futility of warfare, the slow pace of justice, or simply an early medieval version of battling your laundry pile? A truly Sisyphean task. Whatever the exact meaning, it certainly deflates the heroic image of the knight, transforming him into a figure of gentle ridicule. Or you might find aristocratic ladies depicted with exaggerated, even grotesque, fashions, their voluminous sleeves and towering headdresses made to look ridiculous. These visual jabs served as a kind of medieval editorial cartoon, a way to comment on the excesses and foibles of the elite without directly offending them, at least not in a way that could be easily prosecuted. It was art as a safety valve, a release for social pressures, a gentle sigh of exasperation made visible. One particularly quirky and telling example is the recurring image of monkeys dressed as humans, often engaged in human vices or professions. These simian parodies were not just cute or funny. They were deeply symbolic. Monkeys were believed to be mischievous and imitative, and depicting them in human roles, especially those of authority or piety, was a sharp, satirical mirror held up to human folly, hypocrisy, and the perceived absurdity of certain societal roles. A monkey acting as a physician, for example, could be a jab at the perceived incompetence of medieval medicine. Though, given some of the remedies, like the aforementioned crocodile dung sunscreen, you might think the monkey had a point. Even peasants and commoners, though less frequently the target of outright satire, appeared in the margins, often depicted in their everyday lives, sometimes with a touch of caricature. A farmer struggling with a particularly stubborn pig, or a baker with an overflowing oven. These images grounded the fantastical drolleries in a tangible reality, reminding the viewer of the human element beneath the layers of theological text and aristocratic grandeur. And sometimes, these depictions hinted at the anxieties of the time, the fear of famine, the harshness of labor, or the ever-present threat of plague. A creature half human, half beast, might not only be a theological symbol, but also an embodiment of the chaotic, unpredictable forces that shaped medieval life, forces that could turn your world upside down in an instant. The beauty of these marginalia as social commentary lies in their ambiguity. A patron commissioning a grand psalter or book of hours might see a whimsical image and chuckle, attributing it to the artist's eccentric imagination. But to a different viewer, perhaps a cynical monk or a disgruntled commoner with access to such a book, the same image might resonate with a deeper, more critical meaning. This layered interpretation was key to their subversive power. It allowed for deniability while simultaneously delivering a potent message. It was like whispering a joke about the king right into his ear, but in a language only a select few truly understood. You had to be in on the joke, so to speak, to fully appreciate the bite of the satire. Historians still argue whether the ubiquity of certain drolleries, like the knight fighting the snail or the fox preaching to geese, represents a widespread, organized satirical movement, or if it was more a collection of individual artists expressing personal frustrations and a shared cultural understanding of humor and symbolism. Was there a grand plan to subvert, or just a collective urge to draw something funny and a bit naughty? Regardless, these marginal monsters offered a vibrant, often hilarious glimpse into the medieval mind, a mind capable of profound devotion and equally profound, often irreverent social critique. You are now, quite literally, turning the page on what you thought you knew about medieval seriousness. Imagine the scent of old parchment, a faint, earthy aroma that whispers tales of centuries past as your fingers ghost over the vellum. You feel the subtle texture, the slight give of the material, a testament to the animal hides meticulously prepared for the scribe's pen. And there, nestled amidst the solemn Latin of a prayer book or a philosophical treatise, you spot it. A rabbit riding a dog, wielding a sword, or perhaps a monk with the head of a pig. Your breath hitches slightly, a quiet chuckle escaping before you can stop it. This isn't just art. This is an inside joke, a whispered jest across 1,000 years, and it makes you feel like you're finally in on the secret. You're peeking behind the velvet curtain of history, discovering that even in an age often painted with broad strokes of piety and solemnity, humor thrived, sometimes with a biting edge, sometimes just for the sheer delight of it. Though, let's be honest, you probably won't survive the endless hours of copying without developing your own peculiar sense of humor. This isn't merely decorative whimsy. Oh no. We're talking about a sophisticated, often subversive, vein of comedy and satire that ran through the very margins of the medieval world's most sacred and scholarly texts. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of finding a really well-executed meme tucked into the footnotes of a doctoral thesis. It's unexpected, it's often irreverent, and it completely shifts your perception of the content. These aren't just silly doodles. They are drolleries from the Old French drollerie, meaning a piece of fun or absurdity, and they range from the mildly amusing to the downright scandalous, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, even in a book. Consider the visual puns, for instance. Scribal artists were masters of the double entendre, often playing with the very words on the page. A passage about a bishop might be accompanied by a marginal drawing of a fox dressed in clerical vestments, preaching to a flock of geese, a clear jab at corrupt clergy. Or you might see a figure literally turning the world upside down, reflecting that concept of the mundus in verses we touched upon. But here, it's infused with a playful, almost mischievous spirit. It's a way for the artist, and perhaps the scribe who commissioned or approved it, to lighten the mood, to wink at the reader, and to offer a subversive commentary without overtly breaking the serious tone of the main text. After all, it's just a drawing, right? Mere marginalia. Who could possibly take offense at a knight fighting a snail? This particular motif, the armed knight battling a mollusk, is remarkably common, and historians still argue whether it's a commentary on cowardice, a visual pun on a specific surname, or simply a representation of the absurd. a nod to the fact that life itself often presents ridiculous challenges. The humor wasn't always subtle. Sometimes it was outright scatological, designed to shock and amuse in equal measure. Figures literally mooning the reader or grotesque creatures expelling bodily fluids were not uncommon. While this might seem jarring to modern sensibilities, particularly in a religious manuscript, it points to a more earthy, less inhibited form of humor prevalent in medieval society. It was a world where public bodily functions were a part of daily life, and the line between the sacred and the profane was often drawn very differently than it is today. This wasn't necessarily disrespectful. Rather, it could be seen as a way of bringing the divine down to a human level, or perhaps as a pressure release valve for the immense spiritual tension of the age. Imagine working for hours, days, weeks, meticulously copying every letter, every word, and then, almost as an act of rebellion against the sheer monotony, you draw a creature with 3 heads and a human bottom, blowing a trumpet. It's a quiet scream of artistic freedom, a moment of joy in a job that could otherwise be mind-numbingly repetitive. One mainstream historical fact regarding this humor is that it wasn't confined to any single type of manuscript. While often associated with books of hours, psalters, and devotional texts, these drolleries also appear in legal documents, scientific treatises, and even chronicles. This widespread presence suggests that marginal humor was not an isolated phenomenon, but rather an integral part of the medieval visual lexicon, a testament to the universal human need for laughter, even in the most unexpected places. It highlights that medieval people, despite their challenges and fervent beliefs, possessed a robust sense of the ridiculous. They weren't just grim-faced ascetics. They were people who enjoyed a good laugh, a clever visual gag, or a bit of cheeky rebellion against authority, even if it was only on the page. And for a quirky or fringe tidbit, did you know that some drolleries depict what appear to be hybrid creatures playing musical instruments, or engaging in mundane human activities? There are illustrations of half-human, half-animal figures playing bagpipes, or a creature with the body of a bird and the head of a man, seemingly reading from a scroll. These fantastical beings blurred the lines between human and animal, reality and imagination, adding another layer of absurdity and playful inversion to the margins. They challenge our modern categorization, pushing us to consider a worldview where the monstrous and the mundane could exist side by side, even intertwined. It's as if the artists were saying, "You think this text is serious? Well, let me introduce you to a badger playing a lute." It's a delightful defiance of expectations, a secret world of irreverent delight existing just outside the main narrative. So, when you next encounter a medieval manuscript, whether in a museum or a digital archive, don't just focus on the grand illuminations or the main text. Allow your eyes to wander to the edges, to the hidden corners. You might discover a tiny, almost imperceptible scene of pure absurdity, a moment of visual wit that has waited centuries for you to stumble upon it. These humorous marginalia are not mere footnotes. They are windows into the medieval mind, revealing a world far richer, far funnier, and certainly far more mischievous than you might have ever imagined. They remind us that creativity, even in the most constrained environments, finds a way to express itself, often with a cheeky grin and a playful wink. You're trudging through a muddy medieval village, the scent of wood smoke thick in the air, mingling with something less pleasant that you really, truly don't want to identify. The squawk of chickens, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the murmur of rough voices, it all presses in. You pull your cloak tighter, trying to ignore the draft seeping through your threadbare tunic, and the distinct lack of modern sanitation that would, frankly, probably mean you wouldn't survive your first week here. Not to mention the smallpox. But you're here in this messy, vibrant past, and it's a past steeped in stories. Stories told by the firelight, whispered in taverns, sung by jongleurs, and yes, even quietly sketched in the margins of the most sacred of books. Remember how we talked about those weird little figures, the drolleries and grotesques flitting across the vellum, seemingly disconnected from the serious text? Well, sometimes they weren't so disconnected after all. Sometimes these marginal denizens were echoes, visual whispers of the popular tales and moralizing fables that formed the very bedrock of medieval thought and entertainment. Think of it. Long before Netflix or even printed books, how did people share wisdom, impart moral lessons, or just have a good laugh? Through stories, of course. And those stories, particularly animal fables, were absolutely everywhere. One of the most mainstream historical facts about medieval storytelling is the immense popularity of bestiaries. These weren't just zoological textbooks. They were comprehensive collections of real and mythical animals, each assigned specific moral or religious allegories. The lion, for instance, often represented Christ, while the sly fox was, predictably, a stand-in for the devil or a cunning human deceiver. You'd read about a pelican piercing its own breast to feed its young, a symbol of ultimate sacrifice, or a phoenix rising from ashes, a clear metaphor for resurrection. Scribes and illuminators knew these bestiary tales by heart, and their imagery frequently spilled into the margins of other, more ostensibly serious texts. So, when you saw a fox dressed as a cleric preaching to geese, as we sometimes do in Marginalia, it wasn't just a random doodle. It was a visual shorthand for a very specific, very popular fable warning against deceitful preachers, a clear reference to the cunning trickster archetypes so prevalent in their folklore. This connection runs even deeper. The Middle Ages absolutely adored the fables of Aesop, or at least adaptations and versions of them that had survived and proliferated through various translations and retellings. Aesop's tales, with their talking animals and clear moral lessons, were the viral videos of their day. They taught lessons about prudence, diligence, the dangers of pride, and the pitfalls of foolishness. Consider the popular story of the ant and the grasshopper, or the dog and its reflection dropping its bone. These weren't merely children's stories. They were essential didactic tools shaping the ethical framework of society. So, when you encounter a margin drawing of a monkey riding a snail, or a rabbit jousting with a dog, it's not always a literal illustration of a specific Aesopic fable, but it absolutely taps into that deep well of allegorical animal behavior. It's like seeing a meme today that references a classic movie. You don't need to have seen the movie to get the general vibe, but if you have, it's even funnier. Sometimes the connections were more direct. The tale of Reynard the Fox, a hugely popular beast epic cycle, chronicled the mischievous adventures of a cunning fox who outwits all other animals, often the powerful but dim-witted wolf, Isengrim. Reynard was the ultimate anti-hero, embodying cleverness, trickery, and a blatant disregard for authority. You can almost hear the medieval chuckles as you look at Marginalia depicting foxes stealing poultry, or dressed in human clothes, clearly up to no good. These weren't just funny drawings. They were visual punchlines, shorthand for well-known narratives that critiqued societal norms and lampooned the powerful. It was a way for the scribes, often lower down the social pecking order, to gently stick it to the man or the monk or the lord without getting themselves into too much trouble. You could always claim it was just a pretty picture. Now for a quirky tidbit. One particular folkloric creature that frequently popped up in Marginalia and reflects this fabled tradition is the hybrid creature. Half-human, half-animal combinations, often doing very human things. While some were pure grotesques, others, like the half-man, half-dog Sinos Folly or the half-man, half-fish mermen and mermaids, were often drawn from ancient classical and bestiary traditions, but they also bled into popular folk tales. You might find a marginal drawing of a human-headed bird wearing a hat, or a lion playing a musical instrument. These often symbolize the beast within humanity, the struggle between civility and primal urges, a theme central to many fables. It's almost as if the scribe was saying, "Look, we're all just a fancy suit away from acting like animals, aren't we?" And sometimes, these hybrids were just plain silly, reflecting the pure joy of artistic play, unburdened by strict allegorical necessity. Historians still argue whether these marginal scenes were direct narrative illustrations of specific popular fables, or rather, broader allegorical references to the moral lessons those fables embodied. Was it a specific scene from Reynard, or just a general nod to the fox's trickery? Was it a literal representation of an Aesopic fable, or merely an embodiment of the vice it cautioned against? The truth, as often is the case, is probably somewhere in the middle. Many scholars lean towards the idea that while specific fables might have inspired some drawings, the general spirit and morality of fable literature was a much broader influence, providing a common visual and narrative language that everyone understood. So a peasant might not have been able to read the intricate Latin text, but they'd certainly recognize the meaning behind a visual of a wolf in sheep's clothing. The beauty of these fable-infused marginalia is how they bridge the gap between the high-minded, sacred texts and the everyday lived experience of medieval people. They were a reminder that wisdom, folly, virtue, and vice could be found not just in grand theological treatises, but also in the humble stories passed down through generations. These were the stories that taught children, entertained adults, and often provided a safe outlet for social commentary. It's a testament to the enduring power of narrative, isn't it? Even if you're illustrating a book of Psalms, you can still find room for a few cautionary tales about greedy wolves or vain peacocks. Because sometimes, the most profound truths are best delivered by a badger wearing spectacles. The scribes, with their sly sense of humor and their deep understanding of popular culture, ensured that the margins were never truly empty. They were alive with the echoes of shared stories and whispered lessons. You've just immersed yourself in tales where foxes outsmart wolves and clever peasants trick devils. Stories that weren't just for entertainment, but served as moral compasses, guiding you through the muddy paths of medieval life. Now imagine if those moral lessons, those warnings and allegories, weren't confined to spoken fables, but were meticulously catalogued, illustrated, and presented as undeniable truth. Welcome to the captivating, sometimes terrifying, world of the medieval bestiary. These weren't your modern zoology textbooks, neatly categorizing species by phylum and genus. Oh no. A bestiary was a compendium of beasts, both real and imagined, each entry accompanied by a description of its habits, its appearance, and crucially, its moral or theological significance. You see, for the medieval mind, every creature, from the humble ant to the fearsome dragon, was a testament to God's creation, and a symbol imbued with deeper meaning. It was like the internet of their day, you know, full of wild, unverified claims and pictures of things that definitely didn't exist. And yet, they believed it all. Honestly, if you swallowed every bit of information from a medieval bestiary, you probably wouldn't survive your first encounter with a genuinely real badger, let alone a mythical manticore. Think of it, if a lion was noble and brave, embodying Christ's resurrection because it was said to sleep with its eyes open and roar its cubs to life after 3 days. Then a hyena, known for grave robbing and changing sex, naturally symbolized heresy and duplicity. The pelican, piercing its own breast to feed its young with its blood, was the ultimate symbol of Christ's sacrifice. You're not just learning about animals. You're being taught how to live, how to believe, and how to interpret the very fabric of the cosmos through fur, feather, and scale. The influence of these bestiaries on medieval art, and specifically on those marginal monsters you've been exploring, is undeniable. If you've ever wondered why scribes and illuminators would lovingly render creatures that seem utterly fantastical, grotesque, or just plain wrong, a glance into a bestiary provides a hefty part of the answer. Many of the hybrid beasts, the bizarre combinations of human and animal, or the strangely distorted forms you find lurking in the gutters of manuscripts, are direct descendants of bestiary lore. The scribes and artists weren't just making things up willy-nilly. They were drawing from a widely accepted, albeit wildly imaginative, canon of creatures. Take the unicorn, for instance. Not just a sparkly mythical horse for medieval princesses, but a fierce, untamable beast that could only be captured by a virgin. Its horn, believed to possess purifying powers, was highly prized. In bestiaries, the unicorn represented Christ, submitting to the Virgin Mary and then being betrayed and slain by hunters, representing the Jews. So, when you see a unicorn in the margins, it's not just a pretty drawing. It's a condensed theological treatise wrapped in hooves and a horn. Then there's the bonacan, a creature so bizarre it makes you question what medieval zoologists were smoking. Described as having a horse's mane, a bull's body, and horns that curled inward, making them useless for combat. Its defense mechanism, a vast quantity of fiery, corrosive dung, which it could spray over a distance of 3 acres, burning everything it touched. Imagine trying to illustrate that with reverence. It's no wonder these creatures often took on a comical or absurd aspect in the margins. It was perhaps the only way to depict something so inherently ridiculous, yet still real, in their world view. This perfectly exemplifies a quirky or fringe tidbit from medieval natural history. A testament to how far from observed reality some of their facts could stray. This isn't to say every marginal monster was a direct copy from a bestiary. Far from it. But the mindset fostered by bestiaries, the idea that animals were allegories, that the natural world was rife with hidden spiritual meaning, and that even the most outlandish creatures could exist, provided a fertile ground for the marginalia to flourish. It blurred the lines between the sacred and the absurd, between divine order and chaotic invention. The belief that a creature like a griffin, part eagle and part lion, could exist, paved the way for a scribe to invent a part rabbit, part snail knight. Historians still argue whether the common person genuinely believed in every single creature described in bestiaries as literally existing, or if there was an understanding that some were more metaphorical than others. Was the bonacan a real biological threat in the popular imagination, or merely a cautionary tale about? Well, about not getting too close to things with explosive digestive systems. It's a fascinating debate, highlighting the complex interplay between faith, folklore, and burgeoning scientific curiosity in the medieval period. You see, these bestiaries weren't just collections of static images and dry descriptions. They were active participants in shaping the medieval worldview. They provided a vocabulary of symbols, a visual lexicon for understanding both the mundane and the miraculous. And when those ideas filtered down into the hands of the scribes and illuminators, who spent countless hours hunched over vellum, those bestiary beasts, whether real, exaggerated, or purely fantastical, inevitably found their way into the margins, sometimes in recognizable form, sometimes mutated into something gloriously bizarre, but always carrying a whisper of the strange, symbolic universe from which they sprang. They remind you that even when dealing with serious religious texts, there was always room for a little bit of medieval monster mash. A subtle nod to the wild, untamed corners of creation that beckoned just beyond the known. You feel it in the chill stone of the cloister, a whisper from an older, wilder world. It's not just the damp air clinging to your skin, but something primal, something rooted deep in the soil beneath the monastery foundations. You trace the intricate carving on a column, a leaf-strewn face peering out from the foliage, and for a moment, the hushed reverence of the Christian space seems to thin, revealing echoes of a time when gods lived in groves and spirits danced in the wind. You're standing, metaphorically speaking, at a crossroads where ancient beliefs refuse to simply pack up their bags and politely vacate the premises. They lingered, like that one guest at a party who just doesn't get the hint, showing up in the most unexpected places, especially as you've been learning in the margins of sacred books. Now, if you were a medieval peasant, wandering through a newly consecrated church, surrounded by symbols that half made sense, half didn't, you probably wouldn't survive a single theology lecture. Your brain would just short-circuit. Good thing you're listening safely tucked in your bed. The story of Christianity's rise wasn't a clean sweep, a cosmic control plus alt plus delete of every prior belief system. Oh no, dear listener. It was more like a highly ambitious, sometimes messy renovation project. New walls were built, new art hung, but underneath the old foundations, the ancient pipes of pagan thought and practice often remained. This process, where elements of one culture or religion are absorbed into another, is called syncretism. And it's absolutely vital to understanding why those bizarre, sometimes earthy, often deeply un-Christian images found their way into the holy books. Imagine, if you will, the early missionaries venturing into lands where people revered trees, rivers, and the raw power of nature. Telling them to simply stop would have been about as effective as telling a cat to stop napping. Instead, a more pragmatic approach often emerged. Overlay the new onto the old. A sacred grove might become the site of a new church. A pagan feast day might be subtly reinterpreted as a Christian one. It was a slow, osmotic process, not a sudden conversion. The beliefs didn't vanish. They transmuted, went underground, or simply put on new clothes. Consider the green man, that enigmatic face made of foliage, leaves sprouting from his mouth, eyes, or hair. You've seen him, haven't you? Perhaps on an old pub sign, or carved into the eaves of a dusty cathedral. He's a pervasive symbol, and while his exact origins are debated, historians still argue whether his widespread appearance represents an unconscious survival of ancient nature worship or a medieval artistic invention for decorative purposes. His connection to pre-Christian fertility cults and the spirit of the wild wood is undeniable. He embodies the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth, a concept deeply ingrained in pagan European spirituality, long before the crucifix arrived. He pops up in church carvings, and yes, sometimes even peering from the margins of a manuscript, a leafy ancestor winking at the reader from the periphery. Then there are the animals. Remember how we talked about bestiaries? While many medieval animals had Christian allegorical meanings, the lion for Christ, the pelican for sacrifice, others carried a different kind of ancient echo. The stag, for example, was a powerful symbol in many pre-Christian European cultures, associated with forests, hunting, and even kingly power. You see stags leaping through manuscript margins, sometimes in very naturalistic poses, sometimes engaged in bizarre human activities. Are they just decorative? Or do they carry a faint, almost subliminal resonance of their former totemic power for those who viewed them? And what about those twisting, intertwining knot patterns reminiscent of Celtic art? They predate Christianity by centuries. While they became highly sophisticated decorative elements in illuminated manuscripts, especially in insular art from Ireland and Britain, their very forms speak to an older, unbroken lineage of artistic expression that celebrated endlessness and interconnectedness, concepts deeply embedded in pagan worldviews. This blending often created fascinating ambiguities. The very concept of the mundus inversus, the world upside down, which we discussed earlier, might itself have roots in older folk traditions of carnival and seasonal inversion, where societal norms were temporarily overturned. These were times when the boundaries between the mundane and the magical, the sacred and the profane, blurred. And where do these blurred boundaries find their most vivid visual expression? Often in the Marginalia, where a rabbit hunts a dog, or a knight battles a snail, or a naked man rides a fantastical beast. These aren't just random doodles. They tap into a deep cultural wellspring that predates formalized Christian dogma. They might be a visual echo of that pagan delight in chaos, in the breaking of strictures, a release valve for a world that was often rigidly ordered. Think of the creatures themselves. The hybrid beasts, the half-human, half-animal figures, the monstrous forms that defy easy categorization. While some clearly draw from classical Greek and Roman myths, centaurs, harpies, griffins, others feel more primordial, springing from local folklore, from the whispered tales around a winter fire. These are the creatures of the liminal spaces, the wild edges of human experience, much like the margins themselves are the wild edges of the sacred page. They represent a kind of untamed imagination, perhaps an artistic expression of the residual otherness that couldn't be fully contained or sanitized by the dominant Christian narrative. It's easy to imagine a monk painstakingly copying a psalm, his mind steeped in the rigid theology of the church, yet his hand, almost unconsciously, sketching a grotesque half-man, half-fish in the corner. Perhaps he'd heard tales of mermen from his grandmother, or seen ancient carvings in a ruined Roman villa. The power of these pre-Christian narratives wasn't just intellectual. It was deeply ingrained in the cultural fabric, a kind of shared unconscious. The scribes and artists were not isolated from this. They were products of their time and place, carrying within them generations of folklore and myth. It's also important to remember the sheer pragmatic effort of converting large populations. You don't just erase centuries of belief overnight. Sometimes, the most effective way to integrate new ideas is to make them palatable by dressing them in familiar clothing, even if that clothing has a few pagan tassels still attached. So the monsters in the margins, while perhaps appearing purely decorative or even blasphemous to some, can also be viewed as a fascinating testament to the resilience of human belief, a subtle intertwining of the old and the new. They are the visual footnotes to a much longer, more complex spiritual history, a history where the old gods didn't die. They just went on a very long, very odd vacation inside a medieval book. And sometimes, their influence was profound enough that even when copying sacred texts, the human impulse to draw from that deeper, older well of imagery proved irresistible. They tell you that history is never a straight line, but a meandering river, picking up bits and pieces from every bank it touches. You might even say that for some medieval minds, these marginal figures were a way to keep a little bit of the wild world tamed, or at least confined to the page, rather than running rampant through their thoughts. It's like putting a tiny dragon in a terrarium. You know it's there, it's a little bit dangerous, but mostly, it's just something interesting to look at. You're huddled close, the warmth of the imaginary vellum seeping into your bones, and you feel a shiver not of cold, but of something ancient reaching out from the page. You've seen the pagan whispers, the old gods lingering in the ink, but now you consider a different kind of power emanating from those marginal creatures. A power not of belief or folklore, but of active defense. Imagine, if you will, living in a world where unseen forces, malevolent spirits, and pure bad luck felt as real and as tangible as the stone walls around you. A world where disease could sweep through a village like a hungry wolf, where a failed harvest meant starvation, and where the night held more than just shadows. You might scoff at it now, safe in your modern cocoon of science and antibiotics. But back then, you probably wouldn't survive past 40 without a solid dose of grim determination and perhaps a few lucky charms. In such a precarious existence, people grasped at anything that promised a sliver of safety, a shield against the ceaseless onslaught of the unpredictable. And what better place to find such protection than in the very books that held humanity's most sacred knowledge? This brings us to the fascinating, often debated theory that many of those bizarre, grotesque, or outright silly figures cavorting in the margins served an apotropaic purpose. That's a fancy way of saying they were there to ward off evil. Think of them as medieval bouncers for your book, ensuring no spiritual ne'er-do-wells crashed the party. The concept isn't new to the medieval mind, nor unique to manuscripts. You've seen gargoyles on cathedrals, those leering, distorted faces spitting rain from their mouths. They weren't just quirky architectural details. They were believed to scare away demons and evil spirits, preventing them from entering the holy space. If a stone monster could protect an entire building, why couldn't a painted one protect a precious book, or even the soul of the reader poring over its contents? The logic, twisted as it might seem to our contemporary minds, held a certain compelling truth for the people of that era. Consider the sheer range of these marginal monsters. You have creatures with multiple heads, bodies twisted into impossible shapes, figures bearing their buttocks, sticking out their tongues, or engaging in acts of exaggerated vulgarity. Why, in the name of all that is holy, and often these were Bibles and prayer books, would scribes and illuminators painstakingly render such obscenities? One powerful theory suggests these acts of deliberate ugliness, these visual affronts, were designed to repel. Evil, it was thought, was pure and perfect in its own malevolence. It would be repelled by disfigurement, by chaos, by anything that defied natural order and beauty. A demon, stumbling upon a drawing of a rabbit with a human head pulling down its pants, might simply throw up its ethereal hands and decide this particular manuscript was too much trouble. It's certainly a unique form of security, far more entertaining than a password. This idea of fighting fire with, well, weirdness, wasn't just a fringe belief. The widespread understanding that evil spirits could infiltrate daily life, cause sickness, or tempt individuals to sin was a mainstream historical fact in medieval Europe. The Church itself, while condemning outright pagan idolatry, often integrated or tolerated practices that provided a sense of spiritual safety. Relics were revered for their protective qualities, saints invoked against specific ailments, and blessed objects used to ward off misfortune. The boundary between formal theology and popular superstition was often a fuzzy one, much like the edges of some of those ink-stained margins. Then there's the sheer physicality of the figures. Some appear to be caught in moments of intense struggle, as if actively wrestling with unseen forces. You might see a knight battling a dragon, or a hybrid creature grappling with a human. These aren't always illustrative of the text. Sometimes they are self-contained dramas of conflict and triumph. Could these be symbolic representations of the spiritual battles being waged constantly, with the marginal figure serving as a visual champion against the forces of darkness? Or perhaps they were meant to visually exhaust any lingering malevolence, forcing it to expend its energy fighting a painted foe rather than bothering the reader. It's an imaginative thought, isn't it? Almost like a mini-boss in a video game, designed to wear down the opposition before they reach the main character. A quirky or fringe tidbit in this vein points to the deliberate use of the grotesque as a form of visual magic. Some scholars suggest that the very act of depicting something horrifying or ridiculous was believed to contain or neutralize its power. By bringing the monstrous onto the page, it was somehow rendered controllable, its essence captured and rendered harmless, or even turned back against itself. It's a bit like naming your fear to conquer it, but instead, you draw it as a three-headed badger wearing a tiny hat. There are even theories that specific gestures or poses, like the baring of the posterior, an ancient gesture of contempt and warding, were direct, if crude, apotropaic symbols embedded for those who understood the visual lexicon. You remember those cheeky drolleries, don't you? The ones that made you chuckle or raise an eyebrow. Perhaps their humor was a weapon, disarming not just the reader, but any lurking ill will. Historians still argue whether these scribes consciously intended every grotesque to be a tiny guardian, or if it was a more ambient, cultural belief shaping their artistic choices. Was it a deliberate, planned decision by the patron or the illuminator to add protective symbols? Or was it a more subconscious reflection of a world steeped in belief about unseen dangers? It's difficult to fully untangle the intentional from the ingrained. After all, if you grew up in a world where evil lurked in every shadow, wouldn't you naturally reach for any perceived defense, even if it was just a strange drawing of a hybrid creature with a sword? The line between decorative flourish, playful irreverence, and earnest protection blurs, much like the faded inks on some ancient manuscripts. Perhaps it was a bit of all three, a complex tapestry woven from belief, humor, and artistic freedom. The Marginalia, far from being mere distractions, become active participants in the spiritual economy of the medieval world, silently screaming defiance at the darkness, ensuring that the sacred words within remained untainted, and that you, the humble reader, could sleep a little sounder, knowing that a fanged rabbit was on guard. The quiet hum of ancient prayers seems to resonate with the silent roars of these miniature defenders, creating a unique symphony of belief and art that echoes across the centuries. You drift now from the shimmering, apotropaic images that guarded those sacred texts, images designed to ward off the very demons they sometimes depicted, and you find yourself instead in the hushed, often frigid confines of a medieval scriptorium. The air hangs heavy with the scent of parchment, a faint, almost leathery aroma mingling with the metallic tang of iron gall ink. You hear the ceaseless, rhythmic scratch of quills across vellum, a sound that, after hours, days, weeks, begins to merge into the very hum of your existence. You are a scribe, or at least, you're experiencing what it's like to be one. Your fingers, calloused and ink-stained, grip the quill with a practiced firmness, guiding it over the ruled lines, replicating word for painstaking word, the wisdom, or perhaps the tediousness, of ages past. Imagine the sheer, mind-numbing monotony. You are not composing, you are copying. There's no creative spark demanded, no thrilling plot twist to anticipate, no internet rabbit holes to fall down when your attention wanes. Just the endless procession of letters, each stroke identical to the last, each page a mirror of the one before it. You're working under the glow of a single, sputtering candle, or the pale, indifferent light filtering through a high, narrow window. Your back aches, a dull, persistent throb that settles deep between your shoulder blades. Your eyes, strained from the intricate work, blur occasionally, the black letters swimming on the creamy surface of the parchment. You shift, you sigh, you stretch a cramping hand, but the words keep coming, relentless as the tide. This is your life. Hours blend into days, days into seasons, and the only constant is the relentless demand for more perfectly copied pages. Honestly, you probably won't survive this without at least developing carpal tunnel syndrome, if not a deep existential crisis. What do you do when your mind, that restless, untamed thing, begins to rebel against such profound tedium? You can't just stand up and wander off for a coffee break. There's no coffee, and the abbot frowns on wandering. You can't pull out your phone and scroll through amusing cat videos. Your only tools are the quill in your hand, the inkwell beside you, and the vast, inviting emptiness of the margins. It's a human impulse, isn't it? The brain, starved of novel input, starts to generate its own. That little space beyond the hallowed text becomes a canvas for the unconscious stirrings of a bored, perhaps slightly mischievous mind. You finish a particularly dry passage on theological dogma, you lift your quill, and instead of dipping it for the next line of scripture, it just moves. It dances, almost of its own accord, sketching a tiny, absurd figure. Maybe a knight riding a chicken, or a creature with a human face and the body of a serpent. This isn't about grand artistic statements or profound spiritual revelations. This is about the very human need to doodle during a long, excruciatingly dull meeting. It's the equivalent of drawing little stick figures fighting in the margins of your notes during a lecture on, say, the migratory patterns of medieval sparrows. But instead of a cheap ballpoint pen on notebook paper, you have a finely honed quill and precious vellum, and your little doodles have, over the centuries, become fascinating, bizarre windows into the minds of those who made them. The mainstream historical fact here is that monastic scriptoria were the undisputed powerhouses of knowledge preservation in the Middle Ages. These cloistered communities meticulously copied and illuminated countless manuscripts, ensuring the survival of everything from classical philosophy to religious texts, becoming the intellectual bedrock of an era. It's a profound irony that such a serious, indeed holy, endeavor would become the breeding ground for such outrageous, irreverent art. Sometimes, the boredom wasn't just expressed through images. Remember how we discussed the crocodile dung sunscreen? Well, the scribes themselves had their own forms of marginal expression, often far more direct. There are countless quirky examples where scribes, overcome with fatigue, hunger, or sheer exasperation, would scrawl personal complaints or pleas directly into the margins. You might find a note lamenting, "Oh, my hand," or more colorfully, "Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink." Imagine the medieval equivalent of an exhausted office worker muttering under their breath about needing a beer. Only in this case, they've actually etched it into a permanent historical document. Another scribe, perhaps after a particularly trying day, added, "This is a sad and dark day." These aren't just doodles. They're little cries for help, tiny windows into the daily grind of medieval life, whispered across centuries. They reveal the individual human behind the anonymous, painstaking labor, proving that even in the most disciplined environments, the spirit of personal expression finds a way. It's like finding a secret note from the past, a brief moment of connection with a kindred spirit who also just wanted to clock out and go home. The main body of the text, the sacred words, those were sacrosanct. You wouldn't deface them, not intentionally. But the margins? The margins were different. They were liminal spaces, borders between the hallowed text and the blank unknown, or perhaps between the conscious mind and the subconscious wanderings. The unspoken rule, or perhaps the tacit understanding. Was that what happened in the margins? Largely stayed in the margins, and wasn't subject to the same rigorous scrutiny as the main script. This gave scribes a peculiar kind of freedom, a small, rebellious corner of their work where they could be themselves, where their imagination, however warped by exhaustion or whimsy, could run wild. Scholars continue to explore the degree to which these marginalia were genuinely subversive acts, expressions of dissent, or simply an outlet for playful escapism, and the sheer, undiluted boredom of repetitive labor. Was it a conscious act of rebellion against the strictures of monastic life, or just the idle doodling of a tired hand? Historians still debate the precise balance between sanctioned creative expression and genuine subversive or idle doodling. Was it always tolerated, or did some abbots turn a blind eye to the marginal shenanigans, perhaps understanding the human need for such small releases? So, as you trace the bizarre antics of a hybrid beast, or the determined gaze of a knight no bigger than your thumbnail, remember the human hand that guided the quill, the weary eyes that stared at endless lines of text, and the restless mind that, against all odds of monotony, still found a way to create. It's a testament to the enduring power of human creativity, even in the most uncreative circumstances, a quiet rebellion born of boredom, etched in ink, and preserved for centuries. You're huddled over the vellum, the single candle flickering, casting long, dancing shadows of your hunched form across the page. Outside, the pre-dawn chill bites at the stone walls of the scriptorium. Inside, it's not much warmer. Your fingers ache, stiff from the cold and the endless, repetitive motions of penning another line, another paragraph, another entire folio. The air hangs thick with the scent of beeswax and old parchment, a familiar, comforting, yet utterly suffocating aroma. Day in, day out, this is your world. A universe meticulously ordered by the ringing of bells matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nones, vespers, compline, each chime pulling you from one devotional duty or manual labor to the next. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer, unrelenting sameness of it all. You rise before the sun, chant prayers in the echoing chapel, eat simple meals in silence, and then return to the scriptorium, or perhaps tend the monastery gardens or work in the infirmary. There's little interaction beyond essential communication, often in Latin, and absolutely no room for personal expression in the grand texts you're copying. Your identity is subsumed by the monastic habit, your purpose defined by the preservation of sacred knowledge. It's a life designed for spiritual purity, for devotion, for transcending the chaotic, sinful world beyond the monastery walls. And yet, within this meticulously structured existence, within the very fabric of these holy books, an explosion of the absurd, the grotesque, and the frankly hilarious often erupted. This confined world, precisely because of its strictures and its solitude, became a crucible for the imagination. When your external stimuli are limited to the changing light through a narrow window, the droning chant of your brethren, and the slow scrape of your quill, where do your thoughts go? They certainly don't stop. In fact, they might just become more vivid, more insistent, and certainly more bizarre. Think of it as the ultimate form of creative pressure cooking. All that energy, all those unspoken observations, all those daydreams, they had to find an outlet. And for the scribes and illuminators, the margins of their magnificent manuscripts became precisely that, a pressure release valve for the medieval mind. You spend hours, days, weeks on a single page, copying out the intricate Latin text of a psalter or a treatise on theology. Your hand becomes an extension of the text itself, a living printing press, long before Gutenberg ever dreamed of movable type. And in that deep, meditative state, as the words flow from your pen, a small, mischievous imp might just whisper in your ear. Perhaps it's the frustration of a slipped quill, leaving an ink blot that needs to be cunningly transformed into a snarling beast. Perhaps it's the quiet rebellion against the endless, solemn pronouncements of the text itself. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the sheer, unadulterated boredom. We talked about a scribe's boredom before, remember that, when we considered how tedium might have sparked creativity. Well, here, within the very heart of monastic life, boredom wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It was a constant companion, a dull ache that needed an imaginative balm. Consider the mainstream historical fact that the Benedictine rule, which governed most monastic communities in the West, emphasized ora et labora, prayer and work. This wasn't a suggestion. It was the blueprint for daily life, a rigorous schedule that left little room for personal indulgence. Yet, within this framework of disciplined labor, these marginal images flourished, suggesting a fascinating tension between strict spiritual adherence and human creativity. You can't tell me that Brother Thomas, meticulously copying out Leviticus for the 100th time, wasn't fantasizing about a rabbit riding a snail into battle. It's just human nature to seek moments of diversion, especially when your primary diversion is, well, more work. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some scholars suggest that the grotesque figures and monstrous hybrids in the margins weren't just random doodles born of boredom or frustration, but rather subtle visual jokes or even veiled criticisms that only those within the monastic community would fully grasp. Imagine the medieval equivalent of an inside joke, a meme passed around the scriptorium, hidden in plain sight from the uninitiated. Perhaps a certain upside-down bishop with donkey ears was a thinly veiled jab at the abbot's last sermon, or the rabbit pulling an archer's bow back to front was a commentary on the incompetence of a local lord. These images could have provided a secret, shared laugh in a world where overt humor was often frowned upon, especially during the solemn hours of copying sacred texts. It was a way to poke fun, to express dissent, or simply to acknowledge the absurdity of life, all under the radar of serious contemplation. Historians still argue whether these marginalia were truly subversive acts, intentional breaches of decorum, or simply playful expressions that were largely tolerated, or even encouraged. as a means of maintaining sanity and fostering creativity within the demanding monastic environment? Was it a form of permitted, stylized escapism, a safe space for the subconscious to play without undermining the sanctity of the main text? Or were some of these scribes truly pushing the boundaries, subtly challenging authority or orthodox beliefs through the very act of embellishing the sacred with the profane? The truth, as often is the case with history, is probably a complex tapestry woven from all these threads. What's undeniable is that the intense, introspective, and often solitary life of the medieval monk or nun, combined with the rigorous demands of manuscript production, created a unique incubator for artistic expression that defied simple categorization. It reminds you that even in the most disciplined environments, the human spirit finds a way to wiggle free, to doodle, to dream, and to leave its delightfully bizarre mark. You've journeyed deep into the quiet cells of the monastery, peering over the scribes' shoulders, feeling the subtle tremor of their hands as they meticulously copied text, sometimes letting their boredom, their wit, or their subconscious fears spill onto the vellum. You've seen how their own lives, their own inner worlds, might have found expression in those bizarre marginal figures. But now, the lens shifts. You lift your gaze from the scribe's humble workspace to the opulent chambers of a different kind of power, the patron. Imagine, if you will, standing in a grand hall, sunlight streaming through tall, arched windows, illuminating tapestries depicting heroic deeds. You're not just looking at a customer commissioning a book. You're witnessing an investment. Medieval patrons weren't simply acquiring beautiful objects. They were acquiring status, demonstrating piety, consolidating power, and often securing a spiritual legacy. These weren't your average book club members, let's put it that way. You probably wouldn't survive a single dinner party with some of them, let alone convince them to finance your next big artistic venture. Who were these patrons? Well, the roster was as varied as the grotesques themselves. You had royalty, kings and queens who saw magnificent manuscripts as tangible proof of their divine right and their kingdom's prosperity. Think of the French monarchs, for instance, commissioning personal prayer books or grand histories, each page shimmering with gold and vibrant hues. Then there were the high nobility, dukes and duchesses, whose coats of arms often found their way into the book's initial pages, proudly proclaiming ownership. The church, naturally, was a colossal patron, from powerful bishops to abbots of wealthy monasteries, commissioning liturgical texts, Bibles, and theological treatises. And as the medieval world evolved, you started seeing the rise of wealthy merchants, the burgeoning middle class, if you will, who, with their newfound fortunes, sought to emulate the aristocracy, commissioning books for their private devotion or simply as displays of their immense wealth. Even institutions, like nascent universities or cathedrals, would commission foundational texts, ensuring the dissemination of knowledge or the proper conduct of their services. Their influence was profound, stretching far beyond mere payment. The patron dictated the text itself. Was it to be a psalter, a book of hours, a grand historical chronicle, or a collection of chivalric romances? They specified the size, the grandeur, the sheer lavishness of the undertaking. If you were a patron with truly deep pockets, you'd demand the finest calfskin vellum, so smooth it felt like silk beneath your fingertips. You'd insist on pigments so brilliant they seemed to glow, like the legendary ultramarine, ground from lapis lazuli, a stone so precious it was worth more than gold. This wasn't just about making a book. It was about crafting a jewel, an heirloom, a statement of power and devotion that would endure for generations. The overall design, the layout of the text, the size of the margins, the prominence of the initials, all these were often discussed and agreed upon before a single drop of ink touched the page. It was a true collaboration, albeit one where the patron held the financial, and therefore often the artistic upper hand. You peer closer at the illuminated page, your mind not just seeing a fantastical beast, but seeing its journey. You picture a solitary scribe, perhaps in a scriptorium chilled by monastic stone, sketching a bizarre hybrid creature in the margin of a psalter. Maybe it was a fleeting thought, a momentary rebellion against the solemnity of the text, or a nod to a local folk tale. But that sketch, that nascent idea, wasn't destined to remain a singular, forgotten doodle. No, some of these wild imaginings, these curious caricatures, possessed a tenacious life of their own. They hopped from page to page, from monastery to cathedral workshop, evolving from quirky personal expressions into what we might, with a touch of anachronism, call medieval memes. Think of it, an image born of one mind, replicated by another, then adapted, subtly changed, gaining new nuances or losing old ones as it traveled. It's like a game of artistic telephone played across centuries. One scribe sees a particularly clever drollery in a manuscript he's copying, perhaps a bipedal wolf playing bagpipes, a concept so absurd it's brilliant, and decides to incorporate it into his own work. He might even refine it, give the wolf a more elaborate costume, or make the bagpipes more anatomically incorrect. You'd be surprised how much of medieval cultural transmission felt like an ancient, excruciatingly slow version of a viral tweet, except if that tweet took a century to retweet and required meticulous, hand-copied effort. And honestly, if you tried to recreate it yourself, you'd probably lose a finger to a medieval quill or spend the rest of your days perfecting the art of grinding lapis lazuli, which, let's be honest, you probably won't survive anyway. So maybe just listen. The mainstream historical fact here is that this spread wasn't entirely spontaneous. While initial impulses might have been whimsical, the transmission of these motifs was often facilitated by what are known as exemplar manuscripts, or, more broadly, pattern books. These were collections of designs, templates, and compositional ideas that artists and scribes could refer to. Imagine an early medieval Pinterest board, but made of vellum and painstakingly hand-drawn. If a certain marginal monster, say, a particularly expressive dragon with a long, looping tail, proved popular in one region, scribes and illuminators from other areas, upon encountering it, might meticulously copy it into their own pattern books. These books then became repositories of visual canon, spreading motifs far and wide. It meant that a dragon you saw in an English psalter might bear a striking resemblance to one in a French book of hours, not because of some grand, coordinated artistic movement, but because both artists had access to similar visual libraries, perhaps even copies of the same pattern book. Consider the curious case of the knight fighting a snail. This isn't just a quirky tidbit, it's practically a medieval institution. You see it everywhere: tiny, armored figures brandishing swords against surprisingly large, often aggressive-looking snails. It's ludicrous, of course, and that's precisely part of its enduring appeal. What started it? A single clever artist's joke? A reference to a lost fable? We don't precisely know. But once it appeared, it spread like wildfire across the margins of Europe. You find variations of this bizarre joust in manuscripts from England, France, Germany, and beyond. Some snails are colossal, threatening. Others are merely impudent. Some knights are valorous, others comically terrified. It evolved, yet its core absurdity remained intact. This particular motif demonstrates how an initially niche, perhaps even personal, image could be adopted, adapted, and eventually canonized as a recognizable trope, almost a visual shorthand for a certain brand of medieval humor or perhaps a sly commentary on cowardice or overwhelming odds. So how did a simple sketch become a staple? It involved a confluence of factors. First, the inherent portability of manuscripts. A book, once finished, could travel, carrying its visual payload across vast distances. Second, the collaborative nature of scriptoria, where multiple scribes and artists worked alongside each other, sharing ideas and sometimes even directly copying from each other's work or common exemplars. Imagine the chatter in the scriptorium, the quiet hum of activity, and then a sudden chuckle as one scribe shows another a particularly clever hybrid he's just finished, prompting the other to try their own version. Third, and crucially, was the appeal of the motifs themselves. Some marginalia tapped into universal human experiences: humor, fear, the grotesque, the absurd. Others resonated with existing folklore, fables, or even political commentary. The more a motif resonated, the more likely it was to be copied, to go viral in its own deliberate medieval way. It speaks to a shared visual language that developed among the artisans, and by extension, the educated elites who commissioned and read these books. These weren't just random scribbles. They became part of a recognizable lexicon of visual jokes, allegories, and expressions of a rich interior world. The evolution wasn't always just about replication. It was also about interpretation and recontextualization. A monstrous hybrid, initially perhaps a simple doodle, might later be imbued with allegorical meaning, representing vice or temptation, even if its original creator had no such intent. As these images became more widespread, they could be reread and repurposed by successive generations of viewers and artists. This fluidity of meaning, remember how we talked about the world turned upside down and social commentary. It allowed these strange creatures to serve multiple masters, to be both light-hearted entertainment and serious symbolic commentary, depending on the viewer and the specific context of the manuscript. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of certain marginal motifs was primarily due to the direct copying of specific exemplar manuscripts, almost like a chain letter of illustrations, or whether it was a more diffused cultural exchange of ideas and popular imagination, a general zeitgeist that simply manifested itself similarly in different places. Was it top-down transmission via shared pattern books, or bottom-up emergence from common cultural narratives and artistic trends? The truth, as is often the case in history, probably lies somewhere in the middle, a complex interplay of direct influence and independent invention reflecting shared fascinations. Think about it: the grotesque, the hybrid, the absurd. They started as sketches, perhaps even idle doodles, but through a slow, deliberate process of copying, adaptation, and cultural resonance, they transcended their humble origins. They became visual tropes, recognized symbols, and an indelible part of the medieval artistic vocabulary. From the solitary hand of a bored scribe to a widespread visual phenomenon, these marginal monsters found their way into the canon, proving that even the most whimsical of ideas can achieve a surprising degree of immortality, etched onto vellum for centuries to come. You've seen how some of these wild motifs, born from a doodle or a dream, actually clawed their way into the mainstream, becoming almost canonical within the Marginalia. They started as fringe acts, a quiet rebellion, then somehow became part of the expected furniture in the grand, illuminated house of knowledge. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. Even as they became familiar, even as they settled into their little carved-out niches of acceptance, they didn't shed their layers of meaning. Oh no. They only got richer, more complex, like a well-aged cheese or perhaps a particularly stubborn stain on your favorite tunic that just refuses to quit. These aren't just pretty pictures, or even merely funny ones. They are whispers, roars, and knowing winks embedded in the very fabric of medieval thought. You lean in closer, peering at a familiar creature. A fox, perhaps, dressed in a monk's habit, stealing a goose. On the surface, it's a chuckle-worthy scene, a visual gag. But the medieval mind wasn't always about surface-level chuckles, especially not in a book copied by a monk for a religious patron. This isn't just a tale of a thieving animal. It's an allegory, a bite-sized moral lesson wrapped in fur and feathers. The fox, you remember from those bestiaries we talked about, wasn't just vulpine. It was the embodiment of cunning, deceit, and hypocrisy. So, a fox in a monk's habit. That's not just a monk having a bad day. That's a pointed commentary on clerical corruption, the worldly sins creeping into the spiritual realm. It's a visual sermon, perhaps more effective than any spoken one, because it's etched into the very parchment you hold. This is where the symbolism starts to morph into outright subversion. Imagine the scribe diligently copying sacred texts by day. Then at night, under the flickering lamplight, he adds this sly commentary. He can't stand up in the refectory and denounce his abbot for hoarding wealth, not if he wants to keep his teeth, or his head for that matter. You probably wouldn't survive that, let's be honest. But he can draw a fat-bellied pig dressed as a bishop, feasting while peasants starve. He can show rabbits besieging a castle, turning the tables on their traditional predators. This is the mundus inversus in action again, not just a whimsical concept, but a deeply felt, often angry, reversal of power. It's a moment of visual rebellion, a safe space for dissent in a world where dissent was often met with dire consequences. It's a visual vent, a pressure release valve for the collective frustrations of the cloistered life, and indeed of medieval society at large. But not all meaning was so readily apparent. Sometimes you needed to be in on the joke, or perhaps in on the secret. While the mainstream historical fact is that animal symbolism was a fundamental language of medieval thought, drawn from bestiaries and popular fables to impart moral lessons, there are whispers, tantalizing theories that go much deeper. Imagine, for a moment, that some of these bizarre figures aren't just allegories or jokes, but highly coded messages. This is where we delve into the more quirky or fringe tidbits. The tantalizing, if unproven, idea that certain marginalia contained secret codes, alchemical symbols, or even references to esoteric philosophical traditions, intelligible only to a select few initiates. Perhaps that seemingly random mashup of a rabbit playing a lute next to a human-headed dragon was, in fact, a diagram for some forgotten mystical process, a visual shorthand for forbidden knowledge. It's a delightful thought, isn't it? A hidden layer of wisdom tucked away in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes to decipher it. This brings us back to the question of why this subversion. Was it pure malice? Simple boredom, as we mused about with the scribes before? Or something more profound? These marginal spaces offered a unique canvas for social commentary. You find depictions of peasants rebelling, of gluttonous friars, of knights behaving less than chivalrously. The humor, often crude or scatological, served a purpose beyond mere amusement. It stripped away the dignity of the powerful, exposing their hypocrisy and flaws. It was a way for the anonymous, often powerless, scribe to speak truth to power, to subtly critique the very institutions he served. Remember those monks battling snails? It's not just a funny image, it's a profound inversion. The grand, slow snail, often a symbol of sin or sloth, being bravely confronted by the humble monk. Or perhaps the snail represents the crushing slowness of monastic life, and the monk's struggle is a poignant self-portrait. Historians still argue whether the most outrageous drolleries were genuinely subversive acts or merely sanctioned outlets for harmless mirth, a kind of safety valve for societal pressures, allowed precisely because they were in the margins, easily dismissed by the powerful if they even noticed. The beauty of this ambiguity is that it allows for multiple interpretations. The same image could be seen by the patron as a charming doodle, by a fellow scribe as a knowing wink, and by a frustrated commoner as a desperate cry for justice. The boundaries between pious imagery and subversive satire often blurred, creating a rich tapestry of meaning that even today keeps scholars scratching their heads. You see, the medieval world wasn't as monolithic as we often imagine. It was a place of deep faith, yes, but also of profound doubt, of rigid hierarchy, but also of simmering rebellion. And these marginal monsters, these tiny, vibrant figures, were the perfect embodiment of that complexity. They were innocent and transgressive, sacred and profane, often all at once. They allowed for a kind of intellectual play, a mental stretching exercise where the rules of the world could be bent, if only on the page. They were a safe space for the unspoken, for the thoughts that couldn't be articulated in the grand, formal text itself. Think of it. The main text is the official narrative, the sanctioned truth. But the margins, that's the whispered gossip, the behind-the-scenes drama, the unofficial commentary. It's where the human element truly shines through, where the scribes, despite their anonymity, leave their indelible mark not just as copyists, but as commentators, satirists, and even, perhaps, revolutionaries. They were the original meme makers, creating visual shorthand for complex ideas, instantly recognizable to their contemporary audience, and still, centuries later, capable of eliciting a gasp or a chuckle from us. These small, often overlooked spaces became battlegrounds of meaning, stages for subtle acts of defiance or profound insights into the human condition. They remind us that even in the most rigid of systems, human creativity finds a way to express itself, to push boundaries, to whisper its secrets. And sometimes, those whispers become loud enough to echo through the centuries, carrying with them not just humor, but the profound weight of human experience, of the perennial struggle between authority and individual expression. You can almost hear them giggling, those scribes knowing they got away with it right there under the nose of the abbot, forever etched in ink on vellum, for anyone with eyes to truly see. 18. Modern interpretations reflect on how contemporary scholars attempt to decode these medieval mysteries. You peer through the glowing screen of your tablet, a digitized page from a 12th century psalter sprawled before you, its margins teeming with the familiar, the fantastical, and the frankly bizarre. A hybrid creature, half human, half fish, plays a lute, while a rabbit armed with a sword charges a snail. You zoom in, then pan out, trying to make sense of the visual cacophony. It's like trying to understand a dream you had last night, vivid, compelling, but utterly illogical to waking eyes. And honestly, you probably won't survive the intellectual gymnastics required to fully grasp the medieval mindset behind these things. It's a journey into a cognitive landscape so alien, so wonderfully unhinged from our own, that sometimes you wonder if even the scribes themselves fully knew what they were doing. For centuries, these marginal creatures were largely ignored by serious scholars, dismissed as mere doodles, the idle scribblings of bored monks, or artistic flourishes with no deeper meaning. Imagine it. Generations of academics poring over the sacred text, diligently annotating every theological nuance, only to flick past the grinning monkey or the wrestling knight in the border, as if it were just lint on a cashmere sweater. It was only relatively recently, in the grand scheme of things, that the academic spotlight truly swung to these oddities, elevating them from mere curiosities to legitimate subjects of intense scholarly inquiry. This shift in perspective, from dismissing them as irrelevant to embracing them as crucial cultural artifacts, marks a mainstream historical fact in the study of medieval art. The drolleries and grotesques, once considered beneath academic dignity, now form a vibrant, hotly debated field of their own. You see scholars hunched over ancient tomes in hushed libraries, not just for the illuminated capitals or the meticulously copied Latin, but specifically for the mischievous little figures lurking around the edges. It's like suddenly deciding that the scribbled notes in the margins of a genius's notebook are just as important as the masterpiece itself. The modern quest to decode these medieval mysteries is a complex, multifaceted endeavor. Scholars today approach these marginalia with an array of analytical tools drawn from art history, semiotics, literary criticism, and cultural studies. They ask big questions. Were these images literal illustrations of the text, perhaps offering an alternative commentary? Were they satirical jabs at authority, a medieval meme factory operating under the noses of bishops and abbots? Or were they simply expressions of a rich, vibrant popular culture, echoes of folk tales and everyday life spilling onto the sacred page? Each marginal beast, each human-animal hybrid, each absurd scene is now put under the intellectual microscope, scrutinized for layers of meaning, intentional or otherwise. One prevailing theory, passionately argued by some, is that these marginalia acted as a kind of visual counterpoint, a world upside down that both reinforced and subverted the orderly, serious content of the main text. Remember that concept of the mundus in verses we discussed. The idea that society's norms could be playfully, or even scathingly, inverted. This interpretation posits that the marginalia provided a release valve for societal tensions, a space where the rules could be broken, where animals could behave like humans and humans could behave like, well, like animals. It allowed for a temporary inversion of hierarchy, a fleeting moment of chaos to underscore the prevailing order. It's a bit like how we use ironic memes today. They can be silly, but they often comment on deeper social currents. Then there are those who champion the idea of direct symbolism, arguing that every creature, every action, held a specific, decipherable meaning for the medieval viewer. They pore over bestiaries, theological treatises, and allegorical texts, hunting for parallels, convinced that if you just have the right medieval decoder ring, the margins will reveal their secrets like a whisper in the dark. For example, a monkey might symbolize lust or vanity. A rabbit often represented innocence or even courage. And a snail, well, a snail could be sloth, or perhaps, in a quirky or fringe tidbit of medieval symbolism, It could even represent the triumph of good over evil due to its perceived invulnerability within its shell. Yes, seriously, some scholars suggest that, and you thought your Instagram captions were deep. Yet other scholars contend that much of the marginalia was simply playful, a visual form of medieval humor, sometimes crude, sometimes sophisticated. They point to the sheer delight in the absurd, the visual puns, and the often scatological or mildly transgressive nature of some images. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a cartoonist, slipping a tiny, irrelevant, but funny detail into a serious political cartoon, just to amuse themselves and the sharp-eyed viewer. This perspective argues against over-intellectualizing every single drawing, suggesting that sometimes a grotesque is just a grotesque, and a rabbit fighting a snail is simply hilarious. However, historians still argue whether these images were primarily for entertainment, instruction, or even a form of subversive protest. It's a debate that highlights the profound challenge of interpreting art from a vastly different cultural context. We project our own 21st century minds back onto a world that operated on entirely different premises, with different anxieties, different jokes, and different ways of seeing the spiritual and the mundane. The line between solemn religious instruction and riotous secular amusement in the medieval mind was often far blurrier than we might imagine. The development of digital humanities has, remarkably, revolutionized the study of marginalia. With high-resolution digitized manuscripts readily available online, scholars can now compare thousands of marginal images across different manuscripts, regions, and time periods with an ease that was unimaginable just a few decades ago. This allows for the identification of recurring motifs, regional variations, and the tracking of how certain images evolved or migrated from one workshop to another. It's like having a super-powered detective agency dedicated solely to tracking down every last medieval doodler. You can even search for specific types of creatures, type in dragon, and suddenly you're bombarded with thousands of fiery beasts from every corner of medieval Europe. The sheer volume of data, however, also presents its own challenges, making the task of drawing definitive conclusions even more daunting. What seems like a universal motif might simply be the result of a popular exemplar book that circulated widely, or just a particularly good joke that everyone copied. Ultimately, modern interpretations of medieval marginalia reflect our own anxieties and interests as much as they illuminate the past. We see what we are prepared to see, and the monsters in the margins offer a canvas rich enough for almost any theory to find some purchase. Are they expressions of repressed desires, evidence of pre-Reformation descent, or just medieval memes gone wild? The beauty lies in the ongoing conversation, the endless peeling back of layers, even if some of those layers turn out to be entirely of our own making. You contemplate the lasting impact, the persistent, peculiar fascination these marginal monsters hold for us today. You stand, perhaps, in a hushed museum gallery, bathed in the soft, diffused light that caresses ancient vellum. A manuscript lies open under glass, its script a river of elegance, its borders a riot of the unexpected. And there, peeking from the gilded edge, is a tiny, grinning beast, a creature that defies all logic, yet resonates with a strange, undeniable energy. You might think these things are just quaint relics, forgotten whims of a bygone age, but look closely, and you'll find their mischievous gaze still following you. A reminder that even history can be a little spooky, in the best possible way, of course. Why do we keep coming back to them? Why, centuries later, Do we find ourselves utterly charmed by a squirrel riding a griffin, or a rabbit casually beheading a knight? Part of it, you realize, is the sheer audacity of it all. We're programmed, conditioned by our own era, to imagine the medieval world as one of unwavering piety, rigid hierarchy, and unyielding seriousness. We expect illuminated manuscripts to be solemn, reverent, weighty. And then, bam, a dude with legs for arms balancing a sword on his nose. It's the ultimate historical prank, a cosmic giggle from across the millennia, and it utterly shatters our preconceptions. It's like finding out your Stern history professor had a secret career as a stand-up comedian. The dissonance is delicious. These drolleries, these grotesques, they speak to a universal human impulse that transcends time and culture. The need for play, for humor, for a little bit of glorious, illogical rebellion. Even within the confines of a scriptorium, where silence reigned and endless copying tested the very limits of sanity, the human spirit found a way to express itself, to doodle a tiny protest, a whispered joke. They remind us that creativity isn't always neat and tidy. Sometimes, it's a winged cat wearing spectacles, defying gravity and good taste simultaneously. If these guys had Instagram, they'd be viral sensations, probably with a hashtag like medieval meme. Another reason for their enduring grip is their profound ambiguity. Are they moral lessons, veiled criticisms, or just the scribes' equivalent of doodling during a long meeting? This mystery is their enduring allure. Historians still argue whether these marginal creatures were primarily theological allegories, pure artistic whimsy, social commentary, or protective charms, or a complex, layered combination of all these things. The exact balance of intent remains a rich ground for debate, keeping countless scholars delightfully employed. They are the ultimate Rorschach test of the past. Mainstream historical fact dictates that the serious rediscovery and scholarly study of Marginalia, as a legitimate field of art history and cultural studies, is a relatively modern phenomenon, truly gaining momentum in the late 19th and 20th centuries. For centuries, they were often dismissed as mere decorative flourishes or trivial distractions, literally considered marginal. It's only relatively recently that we've begun to understand them not as mistakes or simple doodles, but as profound windows into the medieval mind, offering insights that the main text often couldn't or wouldn't. We're finally giving these tiny rebels the academic respect they deserve. And then there's the sheer aesthetic pleasure. Despite their bizarre subjects, these illuminations are often exquisitely rendered, vibrant with pigments that still sing after 1,000 years. You remember the painstaking process, the vellum, the careful application of blues and reds, even that weird crocodile dung green. These weren't haphazard scrawls. They were deliberate, often highly skilled artistic choices. A quirky tidbit you might ponder is how some of these seemingly random motifs, like the aforementioned knight and snail combat, actually became recurring, almost canonical visual gags passed down through generations of scribes, evolving slightly with each new hand, creating a hidden visual language that we're still trying to fully decipher. It's like discovering the medieval equivalent of an inside joke that everyone in the know just got. These creatures also connect to something deeper within us, perhaps archetypes lurking in our own subconscious, the trickster, the monstrous, the absurd. They tap into that part of our brain that delights in the unexpected, that finds humor in the grotesque, and that sees beauty in the bizarre. They whisper to us of a time when the boundaries between the real and the imagined were far more fluid, when the spiritual and the mundane danced a jig in the same space. They remind us that even in the most pious of settings, the human spirit could not be entirely tamed. That imagination would always find a crack to bloom. The lasting impact is palpable in our own popular culture, whether we consciously recognize it or not. Think of the fantastical creatures in modern fantasy literature and games, the playful subversions of authority found in contemporary art, or even the whimsical, slightly unsettling aesthetics of certain animated films. The spirit of the drollery lives on, echoing in our own attempts to find meaning, or pure joy, in the margins of our own lives. We continue to be drawn to them because they offer a glimpse of unfiltered humanity, a moment of pure, unadulterated expression from an age we often perceive as impenetrable. They show us that even the most serious of endeavors can hold a wink, a nudge, a little bit of anarchy. And as the last faint glow of the past begins to soften, you can almost feel the whispers of those long-ago scribes, their quiet chuckles echoing across the centuries. They left us not just with words of wisdom or sacred texts, but with these delightful, defiant little beings, guardians of both faith and fun, reminding us that life, even a medieval one, was always more nuanced, more playful, more human than we often imagine. You can feel the weight of centuries settling around you, but it's a gentle weight, like a comforting blanket woven from parchment and pigment. The images in your mind begin to blur, the vivid greens and blues softening into a peaceful haze. The knights and snails, the hybrid beasts, the wrestling monkeys, they recede, not vanishing, but simply taking their quiet rest in the vast, dim library of your memories. There's no need to strain to understand every hidden meaning now, no pressure to decode every tiny symbol. Just let the feeling of it all wash over you, the sheer wonder of a time when the fantastical was as real as the vellum beneath a scribe's hand. The whispers of the past are fading, becoming a soft, rhythmic hum, a lullaby of ink and imagination. You're safe here, cradled by history, drifting gently into the quietude of sleep. The mysteries of the margins will be there for you tomorrow, should you wish to explore them again. For now, let your mind wander into the peaceful spaces, beyond the edge of the page, where dreams take flight on silent wings. A sweet dreams,